Welcome to the Waterfowl East podcast.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on. Matthew Wilson here.
Rowan Wilson.
I'm Ted Barney, Waterfowl Biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service Atlantic region.
Hear that, Rowan? He's read a lot of books.
Yep. Couple more than me.
Couple more than you so far, that's for sure. We're here in Sackville, New Brunswick at the Canadian Wildlife Service. What do you call this, the Atlantic headquarters?
It is our Atlantic headquarters office for the region. So our main staff body that governs everything is out of this office, and then we have offices in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia,
no way.
Mount Pearl, Newfoundland, and in Goose Bay, Labrador.
Oh, really?
We do, yeah.
Goose Bay.
Goose Bay, yeah. We have a biologist up there that does a lot of Indigenous engagement and working with those groups on wildlife matters, as well as other staff people that are processing through different things required to be up there. And then we have rotational staff that go into that office. I've done some work up there with our North Atlantic population goose work, and it's great to have an office in a more remote area that we can access and have field gear at and that kind of stuff. And
Well, I suppose that's the thing, right? Because it's kind of similar to when I was in Nova Scotia talking to Julian about, why people built houses and why they built communities out on these points, like where they did, and why people lived on islands. Well, it was closer to the fishing grounds. So I suppose if you're going to track that North Atlantic population, it'd be better if you're doing a lot of work up there to actually have an office up there at some point.
yeah, definitely. And I mean, with the opportunity for wildlife activities and Indigenous partnerships in Labrador, it's a great location. Things are tied to being able to get there and getting out. So, if you're coming across from the northern part of the Newfoundland, you can take the ferry and drive up, or if, for someone like me, it's a bit more efficient to fly. So there's direct flights in and out every day, and makes access pretty straightforward. And we use that as a hub for a lot of work across not just our waterfowl program, but other migratory birds that are on the landscape. So, gulls and seabirds and things that aren't necessarily hunted, but are having research conducted on them.
Cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's neat. I guess I don't really know a whole lot about CWS or where your offices are. I did always know that there was one here, mostly because I had a book, and I don't know if you've heard about this. I asked Ryan, but he wasn't aware of it. Or maybe he had heard of it a little bit, but it's called Confessions of a Duck Cop.
Okay, yeah, I have heard about it.
Did you ever hear about that one?
I have, and I want to say that I've met the author, but when I first got out here, I got a lot of names dropped and kind of met some of the old boys, and I think I crossed paths, but if not, I have heard stories about this book enough times that I think that I have met him and have definitely read it, whether I have or I haven't, because it's a lore and legends kind of book. So
definitely, like, I used to own it, and just in the fray, I've lost it somewheres, and I've looked and tried to find it again, and it's not easy to find. But man, what a good bunch of history in that book! Like the pictures in the back, and where they spent their time, and what the stories that he had in there. I was like, it's really something for somebody from sort of that era to take all those stories, made a career out of that.
Oh, totally.
And put a book together. It's not very big, but it's just cool.
Yeah, and it's kind of a neat connection too, because one of the first proper employees of the Canadian Wildlife Service was an enforcement officer, and he had essentially all of Canada to be out covering, and one of the first areas that they focused on was the Last Mountain Lake area of Saskatchewan, and that's our first migratory bird sanctuary from the late 1800s, and that's been conserved since that time because of its importance for waterfowl. And so, again, one of the first employees for the Canadian Wildlife Service was an enforcement person that was there to try to help enforce, migratory bird regulations at that site. And, that goes a long way back. And we're here today still doing some of those similar things through habitat work and the management we do for waterfowl.
Yeah, that's cool. That must have been maybe shortly after the Migratory Bird Act?
A little bit afterwards, yeah. Canadian Wildlife Service is in the late 50s, early 60s when it was kind of first incorporated into a part of the government of Canada, and then we are year 9 or 10 of officially becoming a branch, which kind of brought us into a forefront of being a more established group that had its own kind of direction, and that's been really helpful on the landscape for again, not only our management programs, but if you think of national protected areas, our national wildlife areas and migratory bird sanctuaries, that's been very helpful to grow that program into what it is now, as well as all the work that's done again on non-game but still migratory birds. So work with contaminants in seabirds or different colonial birds that are on the landscape, whether that's gulls or cormorants or herons. There's all kinds of different work that happens across the country, and species at risk work with different songbirds and things like that. Being a branch has gone a long way to help kind of put us on the map and kind of gain that respect nationally, which has been great. Yeah,
I bet it makes things a lot easier.
Absolutely does, yeah.
It makes you almost feel like you're taking a little more serious, or your work is that much more important.
No, yeah. I think you've been out on the landscape enough, and you get an idea of kind of the passion that the people that work here have, and I think that it carries forward. It just some of the process side carries maybe a bit more awareness now that we have that branch acknowledgement within Environment and Climate Change Canada.
So we got on the topic of the enforcement guys, and I just before we segue into other things, because I wasn't going to talk about that too much, but that book did bring it up. How many guys would you have between all these spots?
Yeah, so there's it's kind of broken into Maritimes and Newfoundland and Labrador, and I don't work directly in that part of the group to know exactly where all their staffing is, but I believe there's 6 or 8 officers in the Maritimes, as well as kind of a manager and some intelligence officers, and then a similar number to cover Newfoundland and Labrador.
Yeah.
We have...
it's a big area.
Yeah. We've got 4 officers here in the Sackville office that cover kind of New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. And then there's 4 officers, I think, that cover Nova Scotia. And then the remaining officers in Newfoundland and Labrador cover Newfoundland and Labrador. And, they're split between all of the regulations that they administer, not just the Migratory Birds Act, but also, some of the species at risk and CITES and things that happen through border trade and looking for, things that are coming in that way. So it's quite a diverse portfolio that those guys have, and obviously keeps them very busy, but it's good that they're on the landscape being able to do what they can.
Definitely. So did you say that there's 4 between New Brunswick and PEI, and then total, and then there's 4 for Nova Scotia alone?
I believe so at this time. Again, I'm not quite finger on the pulse that way, but I think that's a number that is what I last got updated in the fall. So
all you guys from Nova Scotia, I wonder why that is. Anyway, I do want to hear some of your history.
Sure.
And sort of just tell us who you are and how you got to this point.
Yeah, so I born and raised in Southern Ontario. My upbringing background was through more of a university-based scenario. My dad worked for the Animal Science Department at the University of Guelph. Sorry, and in his spare time, he raised parrots. And so from a very young kid, I was taking parrots to school as like a show and tell and that type of thing. So they raised macaws and African greys and a few different species of Amazons, and they currently have, I think, 40 pair of birds still at the house. But anyways, birds were super heavily involved, backyard bird feeders, that kind of thing. Going into high school, I was still really passionate about trying to get into science and research in birds, and focused on parrots. Got grade 12 high school co-op. Just happened to play soccer with a guy whose father, Dr. Tom Nuds is his name, and and he did a lot of waterfowl science, prairies and other things. And he had a graduate student that was using ultralight aircraft to teach trumpeter swans to migrate.
No way.
And at the time,
Wow.
he was hoping to get me on that project. And I was supposed to, go to the U.S., to the wintering areas, spend time down there with these guys to train these trumpeter swans to fly behind an ultralight. And then I would be on the ground crew while the student was in the airplane flying back into kind of was central Ontario area that they were trying to reintroduce these migrating populations. And it didn't work out. The field crew was mostly females, and at the time having a 17-year-old kid added to that meant an extra room and different things. So like logistics kind of fell out.
Sure.
But Tom was I'd known him for a bunch of years with again playing sports with his son, and he put a call out, and Dr. Scott Petrie, who is Delta Waterfowl, and at the time was working for Long Point Waterfowl, which was a program through Bird Studies Canada. He had a PhD student starting that needed a technician, and I, being free, was a very well-priced technician to show up. So I actually took a double co-op in my fall year of grade 12 and packed my bags, moved down to Long Point, Ontario, which is a super rich area of waterfowling history in Canada. The oldest club in Canada is there. The Long Point Company is established in 1866, so it's actually a year older than our country, and has been a consistent club owned by members since that time. But I got immersed in this duck culture, this waterfowl culture. We were looking at tundra swans and their behaviors and foraging habitat or foraging activities while they were staging both spring and fall. And at that time, I got more exposed to hunting. All the graduate students, Scott was a big hunter. The advisory committee coming out of our research program and different things there, all these guys hunted, and I hadn't really had that exposure of that kind of level of people growing up. When someone's got a PhD in waterfowl and is out in a blind, it's kind of like there's a whatever level of respect that comes with that. And for me, it clicked. It was like, okay, I can spend my career working with birds, which is what I wanted to do, but I can also do that potentially at home in my backyard and get paid to do it rather than volunteering. And, absolutely nothing wrong with volunteering. I've done all kinds of volunteering and gotten on some super cool projects. But to know that there was a career potentially out there to do waterfowl science was super inspiring for me. So I went back to high school, finished out, did my undergrad at the University of Guelph, did my master's with Scott at Western University in London, and then spent 8 years working for him at Long Point Waterfowl, and had a year with the Ministry of Natural Resources in Ontario as a management biologist. So I did, deer, season lengths and bag limits and tags and that kind of stuff, and did some survey monitoring for species at risk and some wetland habitat work, dealing with invasive Phragmites, which is not on the landscape here quite to the same extent, but is a big conservation issue in Ontario. And I had an opportunity to apply to the Canadian Wildlife Service out here with the Protected Areas Program. So I took a job here and worked in national wildlife areas and migratory bird sanctuaries for roughly 5 years, and then had opportunity to take this waterfowl biologist job. Person prior to me, Bruce Pollard, was retiring, and had that opportunity to come in and replace him once he'd retired. So I've been in this job for essentially 3 years and loving every day of it.
Yeah, I remember Bruce being here and talking to Bruce in the past. And
Okay.
how many years did he work here?
He was 18 or so years, I think. And
long time.
Yeah, it was a long time. And I mean, another person that's been, right through the beginning of, he worked for Delta, he worked for DU, he worked for CWS in the prairies. And then, he worked for the province of Ontario for a while, was there at the kind of middle point of wild turkey reintroductions and introduction of that season and things like that, kind of on the, like the early 90s timelines. And then, he was out west for a bit, and then had the opportunity to come here and replace the former biologist. Myrtle Bateman was her name, that had been kind of a career biologist here as a waterfowl person. Big shoes to fill, but great to have had some time to spend with Bruce and, kind of get some training from him, and, kind of brings you back to teaching swans to migrate. It's nice to have someone to, show you the ropes and you can follow in behind on. So I've had a, pretty exciting, been lots of places, worked in the prairies. I've worked up north in the Arctic with geese, lots of stuff through almost all of Ontario. And from 1998 onwards, I've done essentially nothing but waterfowl stuff, either professionally, privately, personally, volunteering, all that thing. And it's a 365-day addiction that I enjoy having.
Love that. No, that's awesome. One thing I wanted to reel back on, you said that you worked, was it Scott Petrie?
Correct, yep.
At Long Point?
Yep.
So at the club?
No, not at the club.
Just.
Yeah. So Birds Canada is Canada's largest non-for-profit bird research and citizen science organization, and part of that there's a waterfowl program. Yeah. And Scott was the executive director of that waterfowl program, and he hired me out of my graduate work to be the biologist there.
So it seems like, and it was sort of the same thing when I was talking to Ryan, like when you go to school, you start out, you're going to university, you're trying to get summer jobs, it seems like not that you're starting a job and not finishing, but you get the opportunity to work for Delta Waterfowl. They do a project that might only be so long. You volunteer or you work for them in the summertime, and then maybe you get another more permanent position at Ducks Unlimited, or you sort of get lots of different experience in your career.
Yeah. I mean, I did, and that you spoke to Ryan, like you hear his story, and it's mirrored a little bit in terms of where we had opportunities to work and the people that you meet, and as you know, in the hunting world or whatever world you're looking at, the world's not that big. Right. So in the waterfowl science and management side of things, the world isn't that big, and some of the opportunities that come from these organizations, whether it's, federally, I did 2 summers as a federal summer student, working for Prairie Region of Canadian Wildlife Service, and I was a waterfowl technician doing spring surveys and banding, and that's what got me the highest north. I was on Southampton banding geese there, and great time. But it can come from the private sector or provincial or federal jurisdiction as well. But it's the experience that comes with it, and then also for people that are listening or in the room that are thinking about that as a career, there's certain things that a lot of people that get into the management side of things and the science go and gain those experiences. So, I mean, like the prairies is a huge driver, 50-ish% of the duck population comes out of the prairies, every good year, and it's more if it's wet. Right. We don't necessarily see those birds here in, the Maritimes or the Atlantic region, but the driver of ducks really comes out of the prairies. And if you want to understand that, going to the prairies is a really smart thing to do. And then there's a whole world tied in with Arctic and subarctic nesting geese, and that's another world that if you get to dabble in that, there's again a smaller group of people that are tied to that all kind of have connections and collaborate and what have you. The sea duck world, I haven't done a ton of sea duck stuff, but I was involved in a big satellite tracking program for long-tailed ducks in the Great Lakes, and so we put out a bunch of transmitters and banded that was almost 400 longtails, I think, over 2 winters of catching them, which at one time was the highest number of bands put out in the Great Lakes at any one point for that species. So you just get really cool experiences, and coming out here and being able to work and sort of put all that past exposure and those connections moving forward is really how we all really kind of work in the business, right? And you've got colleagues across the country that share similar stories, or you worked with as a student, or Delta bringing research students, and Ducks Unlimited Canada or Ducks Unlimited Inc. in the U.S. bringing graduate students on through different labs and universities. People network, and those connections move forward into life and career, and it's getting the experience that you can. And when you don't have necessarily a lot to start out with, volunteering is a great way. There is a point that everybody's volunteered enough where you've got the experience that you should probably get paid for what you're doing. But if you have never participated in a survey or done something, there's lots of volunteer opportunities out there that I would recommend people to do if they're interested in going that route. And school's the other part of it. You've got to kind of get to a point where you've probably got an undergraduate degree, and having a master's degree is relatively important these days for getting some of the kind of biologist level jobs, whether again it's for private sector or the public.
Yeah, they want you to have a master's.
Yeah, it's just and with that comes education, but also comes the experience, right? Like you're at a point at which if you've done an undergrad, you've got 4 years of teaching, but also hopefully summer jobs that were in the field, right? So you've got that 4 month between spring semester and fall semester that if you can get out and work for some of these groups, that's a perfect time, because they've got lots of research projects going on. They need technicians, and that is a story that a lot of people have done. And again, you can move that around if you've got an interest of one kind of bird or one group of birds. Somebody out there is doing projects, and it's about connecting with those folks and trying to either volunteer to get your foot in the door, and then applying for jobs.
When I was in high school, I was thinking of going down that path, and I had looked at the Fish and Wildlife Technology product or course, but otherwise, I remember talking to my guidance counselor, going, "How do I become a waterfowl biologist?" And they were, being from Woodstock and whatnot, they looked around. There's well, there's really no course that's waterfowl biology 101.
For sure.
That's going to get you there, right?
Yeah.
So when you're talking about you went to this school and then you switched over when you were going through and you did your master's over here, and if you wanted to continue on, you could do your doctorate. That makes sense to me, because at the time I was I don't know how people actually become a biologist ever, because there's no, there's no straight path.
For sure. And I think some of it, again, for people that are thinking about doing this kind of thing, sometimes it's, the passion that person carries forward with them, right? They maybe have a relationship with their guidance counselor or somebody that's out there that, whether they hunt or fish or has an understanding or maybe knows somebody, that works for the province or federally that can kind of help guide. But sometimes it's people find a roundabout way to getting to where, we're sitting today. People that end up taking technician courses at colleges that then transfer over to an undergrad, and then, get some, different teaching and skill sets. And then that leads to being aware of who's doing research where. And it's kind of a bit about just exposure time and sort of knowing what you want. And to some extent, you get to university and, maybe you apply for general biology, but you're kind of there in a 4-year time span to really get a lot of experience and maybe pick that 1 or 2 subjects that's really drives your passion, and then you go chasing that. And when you go chasing, you're reading scientific papers and certain names keep popping up, and then there's an email address you can send an email to and say, hey, I'm just interested. And sometimes that goes a long way, and it opens a door, and you walk through that door and you go, oh my goodness, I didn't know this room existed, but I'm happy I finally found it.
Well, that's the thing, from again, now, I've wanted to do these interviews in succession, because it's really good to sort of hear the same story from Ryan to you, because it sounds like a lot of networking. Like, you got to be sort of a go-getter. You're not going to be sitting there and people are just going to be throwing opportunities in your lap. You network, and then you take opportunities to volunteer and, get your pound of flesh in the game for free.
Yeah,
And
totally. And I mean, I think it's, maybe all our paths take a different winding road. And if you go, kind of the generation or the cohort before me, there's some people that are in retirement age brackets, but I mean, you listen to their stories, and it just happened to be that they were at Delta or working for DU in the 80s rather than the early 2000s. Right. And it's something that right now there's, super smart students with super smart supervisors that are doing some really cutting edge science. And those people are being trained for the 10 or 15 years down the road when, the next cohort of people retire and, out there, and it kind of repeats itself, and it does across lots of different, sciences, and, whether it's fisheries or big game biology or whatever, there's kind of the same sort of thing. But for my story coming here, going north and doing some goose stuff, I did that out of my co-op. I spent 3 years working for the province of Ontario on Agamaskie Island, and that was kind of at the time the point at which people were really talking about what snow geese were doing to grazing grounds and eating themselves out of house and home, and Agamaskie was sort of a micro habitat of what was going along all of the James and Hudson's Bay coast. So you had this island that was offshore that you could kind of do some work in a more accessible way, because there was both Canada geese and snow geese nesting on this island, and the snow geese had really grazed the habitat, and you could look at that at a smaller scale rather than trying to get from the bottom of James Bay all the way up to the top of Hudson's Bay and hope that, you had the opportunity to like work at that level, because, there's finances always control the bottom line of everything. And so there was a research camp there and a bunch of really cool work coming out doing goose stuff. And, that led to me meeting a bunch of people, and that led to 2 summers of being a student for the federal government in the prairies. And that led to meeting a bunch of people at Delta at student seminars and doing things. And yeah, I volunteered on my own time in mornings and weekends to do secretive marsh bird surveys for Ducks Unlimited Canada, because I just was out in the prairies, never been out there before. There are more birds than I had ever seen, and I had just come off of James Bay. There's a heck of a lot of birds up there when the geese are coming through, and it was just mind-blowing about like how exciting this could be. And I took every opportunity I could at the time to just meet and network and go from there. And you mentioned the pound of flesh, you make it back.
Yeah,
so
I bet you do.
Volunteer citizen science projects that are out there. There's a bunch of really cool ones. Get out there and do what you can. And if you've got interest, don't hesitate to reach out, right? People have their contact available. Lots of places that are doing cool science or doing, management level work for, federal level or provincial level, like, touch base with those folks, and there, you never know, there might be opportunities or whatever. So, yeah,
it seems like it's almost, in a way, sort of a cult following. Like anytime there is a project, they know they're going to need a certain amount of help, and the more help that they can get with people that are willing to volunteer, well, that's great, because it helps the project, and that person has a passion for it, obviously, and is trying to, show face and do the work and get their name out there, and it helps the project move forward as well.
Oh, totally, and like I said, you make that investment back, right? You start out as a volunteer. They see your passion, and you're working hard, you're doing the job right, and they say, oh, I might have a position next year, and then that leads to something that all of a sudden leads to something else.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
Yeah, and it's and it can come from sort of the hunting side too, of sitting on a local chapter for some of those groups, whether that's Delta or DU, and, the work that they do as stewardship activities, whether that's hen houses or nest boxes or, eider shelters, in coastal areas. Like there's lots of opportunity for people to give back to the resource, but also connect to the people that are doing the management, on the landscape.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Any questions on that, Rome, before we keep going?
When you did your undergrad, where did you go specifically?
Yeah. So I went to the University of Guelph. They had a wildlife biology program, which I think they still do. And that's where I went. And then from there, I did my master's at University of Western Ontario, which they're now referred to as Western University. So both in Southern Ontario, but at the time, those schools still had a relatively strong wildlife-based platform. And then again, people at the time that were there that were doing some really key waterfowl work. So Dr. Tom Nuds was at the University of Guelph. He was a community ecologist that looked at kind of broad scale impacts of different drivers of what drove duck populations on like the prairie landscape. So he was doing a bunch of prairie work and some things locally in Ontario and stuff too. And then I didn't get to overlap with Dr. Dave Ankney, but he was kind of a front runner and leader in energetics of Arctic nesting geese. So figuring out kind of what geese need to, fly into an Arctic situation where things are pretty much frozen. How does their energy leave their body and get into their eggs, and what does that mean for success in a clutch and bringing that out to a population level and that kind of thing. So Dave did a whole bunch of kind of pioneering work in that, and
he was teaching at that school.
He was teaching at Western at the time. He retired just before I started my master's, and they replaced him with somebody else. But at that time, Scott Petrie was adjunct there, and so it was kind of like having somebody that's in the private sector doing research that's tied to the university.
Gotcha.
So Scott was one of my supervisors, and then I had a second supervisor, Dr. Leanna Sinet, that was a songbird researcher, and they co-supervised me through my project that way. So it was kind of a neat way to have somebody really wanting to do kind of management level questions about, like whatever you ask a question, you get the answer, and then that gets applied to maybe how that reacts to a population of a hunted species in sort of a way that's applicable that, you guys on the ground get to see that. So it was kind of nice to have, something that science that I was doing was kind of going out onto the landscape, and you could see how that plays into maybe regulation setting or something like that. And
Sure.
Over time, that sort of progressed to where I am now, where I'm really seeing how decisions that are made at management level then go out to, regulation setting and doing those kinds of things. And the work that we're doing, reflected on what's happening out, in the marsh or in the field, this coming or past falls or future falls to come. So it's kind of been a progression going forward, but really cool that the work that I do has an impact to, Canadians that are out hunting and something that, that I do myself get to, use that in the fall, which is super cool.
Yeah, no question. And I mean, the fact that, you were asking about his undergrad, the fact that you got to do that with people that were bird specific was good.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And I mean, and there's, lots of great researchers doing really neat bird stuff and waterfowl stuff, still across the country, and it's, those opportunities are out there, and, kind of big jump that also happened for me, was, getting out of high school, because then you're available late April through to late August, and a lot of the work that gets done on especially breeding ground work and things that way happen in sort of early May and into June. And
Right.
When you're a high school student, it's hard to be able to be in the middle of the prairies or up north doing goose stuff at that time of the year. And
Right.
so like the door kind of got opened in my co-op in high school, but it sort of blew wide open once you could apply to 15 different jobs and just see where it went, and trying to do different things with different species and or groups of species. It just that door opens up, and then there's people doing research that is happening at the university year round, and that gives you other opportunities to connect with people too and network, and visiting scientists that give presentations. I had a guy that was I can't remember, he was from Missouri, I think. He came up and all his research was looking at how white-tailed deer communicated through scent. And
Right.
he had captive deer that he would use different sets at different times to see what that did with respect to how the breeding season went or whatever else. And I was just kind of joking with him. We went out to dinner afterwards, and I said, man, like tinks game sense must really want you to participate.
Oh, yeah, that's what I was thinking.
All that stuff, right? And we just kind of laughed about it. But I mean, it was one of those things that I never would have had a direct connection to anything like that until I got to university. And you just kind of
you just meet
take
people.
those experiences. And I mean, there's lots going on. Universities are a busy place with all sorts of different professors doing research, but also bringing people in to collaborate, and it really can be a melting pot in such a positive way. So I should be excited when school starts and moving on to that next stage, because it's really like a blank slate. All of a sudden, you can paint your own picture on it.
Yeah,
and take those chances and do those things.
Yeah, to be that age again, to be able to go, and it's like you said, it's a blank slate, man. I mean,
totally. Yeah.
When I hear about like your journey and how the places you've been and the projects you got, and I mean, you can tell looking at you that when you reminisce on those things, like those were good times in your life, man.
Totally. And I mean, the other thing it does for people that are out there that, somebody's coming up and sends you, reaches out to somebody, sends them an email and says, oh, here's my resume, right? There's some like check boxes that happen. Like if you've done a couple seasons in the prairies, and, me having done that, I have an idea of what it takes to kind of get through that. So you get a good gauge of what people are like. Yeah. Right. So like, you talked about Ryan. I've joked with him a couple of times that, his story and mine are about 10 years apart. But, when I had the opportunity to interview him for his position, like I had a pretty good idea where he was and what kind of person he was, because I had done, 75% of what was on his resume. Yeah. I just happened to do it a few years before.
Been in the same places.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Same people. Like, it's like, oh, do you know so-and-so? Oh, yeah, I know so-and-so. And did they do this? They do. And, you share a laugh and away you go. But, like we've said, the world's not that big. So, those experiences, and it sort of seems like it repeats, but that's just because that's how kind of the grind works to get yourself into these kinds of roles. And, there's opportunity and don't be scared to travel either, right? Like, some of that can be a bit hard to, break in if you want to stay just in one spot. Canada's a big place. There's lots of opportunities across there, but it can get a little bit small if you're trying to stay, a little bit local, because those opportunities, once they're available, people snatch them up, and, they're pretty rewarding jobs, and people want to keep those. And, sometimes people are in them for a long time. So you got to move around a bit.
Well, and you made a good point when you said that, because, when you said about the prairies, what it takes to get out there, and nobody's just going to feed that to you.
Sure. Yeah.
There's obviously a process that you've gone through to get there, and, when you went to the Arctic, things like that, that's all good experience for you. And I feel like it's that way with a lot of things, that if you're a go-getter and you really want it, like you'll make the connections, right? Mm-hmm. You'll be the person talking to people or trying to get in on projects or volunteering, whatever you have to do at the start of things. But it made a lot of sense when you said, like, right now for somebody like him, he's not available.
Yeah,
right.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. Until like summertime, and then he's available. Once they graduate, I mean, those are the years when you can ram around and be like, hey, you want to go to Saskatchewan?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I worked with a guy that just kind of went from technician to technician job, and he like literally traveled the world, and he took about a 10-year time period where, he'd finished his undergrad and he just went from contract gigs to contract gigs, but he did bird and other wildlife research across the globe and just applied to jobs, and one worked out. He jumped on a plane, like he was doing shrikes, or a predatory songbird that impale their prey on thorns. They're called the butcher bird sometimes, but they're basically the size of a blue jay. They have a hooked bill like a red-tailed hawk does, and they catch small mammals and small songbirds, and they use that hook on their bill to break their necks. And they will take the prey that they don't need to eat right then, either for themselves or for their chicks in the nest, and they'll impale them on hawthorn bushes, or if you're in a place with barbed wire fences, they'll string them up down the barbed wire fence. And Israel just happens to be a place in the world where there's a super diverse group of these shrikes. And this guy, through bouncing around, spent like 6 months in Israel, working on shrikes, studying their behavior and different things. And then he was, up in the north and down the south and all over the place. And I mean, you can't buy that kind of experience in life, and to get paid to do it is just, icing on the cake.
You'd learn to pack pretty light, wouldn't you?
I think you would, yeah. But you'd know how to pack the right kind of stuff.
Yeah, bag always packed.
Yeah, exactly. But
anything else, Rowan?
So your undergrad was 4 years, did you say?
It was 4 years, yep.
And then how long did your grad school take?
Yeah, so I took a little longer than most people do. I decided to start a family and do some things in that timeline, so it extended a little bit. But typically a master's is about 2 years. So you come in, you write a proposal for what your project's going to be about, and typically you're applying to a project that's already established for the most part. And then there's often 1, potentially 2 field seasons worth of data collection, and then you write that up, and you have a thesis, and you defend that thesis, and then you go to try to publish that in a research journal so that your information is then shared with the academic community. So to get through an undergrad into a master's, you're 6 to 7 years, and then a PhD typically runs 4 to 5 years on top of that. And depending on which part of the game you want to get into, if you want to be a professor that's, teaching wildlife management somewhere at a school, there's, postdocs that people do, and they get teaching gigs, and, it can take a bit of time to get established. But, I think it can sound like a lot, but I do tell folks that, if education is a huge part. Like if you want to be a biologist or a someone that's managing for an NGO like Delta or DU, those folks have masters or PhDs, and even at a technician level, people are at a master's level now, because it just gives you that experience and that diversity too. You haven't just done kind of one thing in the timelines it takes you to get through that 6 years of school. You've had a bunch of experiences, met a bunch of folks, and it goes a long way.
It makes a lot of sense to me now when you lay it out like that, because it's not like there's 10 of you in this office. Doing this job.
There's
so.
For our waterfowl program here, anyways, with the Canadian Wildlife Service, there's myself. We have our marine game bird biologist, Bob Rogers in Newfoundland, and then there's 2 technicians. So Ryan, who we already met, and then a fellow named Andrew Hicks, that's our other technician. We've got a head as a supervisor and a manager, and it goes up the kind of the chain that way. But there's really, for the waterfowl program that Canadian Wildlife Service runs in the region here, there's 4 core people that do that across the 4 Atlantic provinces.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah,
a lot for you, a lot of area to cover.
It is a lot of area, and I mean, we have great relationships with people through the provinces, through Delta, through DU, through some other NGOs, and then some other folks that have been doing some waterfowl banding for us that help us really get through those seasons. And it's definitely being 3 years in this position, I can't say that I know everybody or have met everybody, and I think that building those relationships moving forward helps us to deliver that program. And there's lots of levels to what those relationships can be, and trying to do more to do that. And it's really been nice to be able to start those things and look forward to the years to come to really build upon those too.
Well, and a good example of that is this right here.
Totally.
Like it's great to meet you. And I mean, we come from an area where you guys, in the years that I've been around, haven't worked in a lot. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's been some projects up through that way, but, making those relationships with people that are in those areas that can send you information that might spark your interest in coming up to those areas to do work in the future. I mean, I suppose that's all part of your networking at the same time, right?
It is definitely.
I mean, you're not going to come up to Woodstock and drive around for 3-4 days wondering if you're going to find what you need. It's got to be pretty concrete. You know?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, some of it's timing too. And again, like with 3 of us here in the Maritimes, there is some logistics that just we can't be bigger than those 3 people, right?
Yeah,
So, but
sense.
Having those connections and learning about, timing of when birds and which species are coming through, definitely helps us moving forward. We'll probably get talking about our North Atlantic population goose work. There's certain times a year where we're trying to catch those birds and get our GPS net collars on them for research, but also just getting bands out for marking populations. And we have similar programs for ducks. And our main driver species-wise is American black ducks, and we need to put those bands out before October 1st. So having areas of good concentrations that we can get to and get traps out and bands deployed, that changes. The landscape changes, climate changes on the landscape. Wetlands aren't maybe what they were, not necessarily in terms of quality, but just what that wetland's doing at the time that the birds had been there 20 years ago, or the timing that the birds are coming south. We've seen fall migrations protracting to being later and later, and some of the places that we used to get a lot of bands out, we can't do in the timelines that, because the birds aren't there anymore. It's not that the population's decreased, it's just the birds haven't showed up yet. So we have to, evolve to make the program work. And meeting people like you to learn about where birds are maybe timed in your location is something that could help us a lot in the future for sure.
Yeah, because really in this province, like you and I spoke about it on the phone, it's a pretty big area now, just because of the cereal grains and the things that have changed. Like from when I was a kid until now, that whole, I guess we'll just call it a flyway just for conversation's sake, has really changed.
Sure.
Like the amount of birds that come through now over a year would be years and years when I was a kid. Like we just didn't have the population, and now that we have the amount of corn that we have, and possibly there's more birds on top of that, they're there. And when they come back through in the spring, they're there again. There's a lot more birds around. And so much so that, I remember when there was only 4 or 5 groups around that did it.
Right. Yep.
And now there's more groups because there's more birds. Otherwise, people would still continue to hunt, big game and partridge, things like that people in this province normally hunt. But when there's more and more waterfowl around and more people get into it and more people try it, well, they're only going to do that if the resource is there, right?
Sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So things have definitely changed in a lot of ways around home since 2000. So we'll say the last 20 years for sure, 25 years, but for sure the last 20 years, a lot has changed.
Yeah, and it's funny that you bring that up, because it'd have been the mid thousands, early 2010s that someone coined the good old times are now for waterfowling, right? And
they are
record populations coming out, on spring surveys, and it's a good time for it. Populations out here in the east are very stable. And that's showing that our management practices are doing well for, again, the bulk of the birds. There's always something that you can talk about that's maybe not on the landscape as much as it was 20 years ago, but we've got good general waterfowl populations. We've got good general goose populations, and, the people that like to be out there should have a good time. We've got 107-day seasons, no more restrictions in dabbling duck bag, and the good old times are now, and it's great being on the management side to see that.
I bet.
I bet it really is.
Yeah, it's got to be in a way. What you guys decide is a factor.
Sure.
So if it's producing, you're doing something right. So that's got to make you feel good.
Yeah, and it what our our oversight between spring surveys and banding and harvest survey that happens in the fall, we've got what I like to say is a pretty good understanding where populations are, and again, populations are stable for the most part across the board, and
that's good.
That's providing good opportunity for people like yourselves to be out in the fall and enjoying a good pastime and enjoying the resource.
Let's talk about geese.
Sure.
Because that's certainly our passion. That's we in our area, 98% of our hunting is dry land. And not that there isn't ducks there, because there is ducks, but we're goose hunters. That's how I'd identify as a goose hunter.
Yeah.
You a goose hunter, son?
Yep.
I want to assume here.
And everything hunter, basically.
Yeah, and everything hunter, but we like geese. So we talked about North Atlantic population and Atlantic population geese, and you said that populations are stable. So what are you doing for work around Canada geese?
Yeah. Identifying populations is something that happens really just for management, right? We've got groups that sort of breed in a general area that remains consistent, and then they winter in an area that remains consistent. So the North Atlantic population birds nest over insular Newfoundland up through eastern Quebec into Labrador. And for the sake of the population and at a management level, we count geese that maybe nest in Greenland or elsewhere. Further, Greenland is about as far east as we're getting Canada's coming from, but east of Labrador counts as a North Atlantic population goose for the sake of management discussion.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. No, because that's what I was going to ask you. What do you consider a North Atlantic?
Yeah, so it is that breeding range. So if you think of island of Newfoundland, and you went straight up to the western edge of Labrador.
Yeah.
There's a bit of eastern Quebec in there, all of Labrador, and then any bird that would be further east.
Sure.
So coming out of Greenland. And that's what we consider a North Atlantic population Canada goose. Those birds winter somewhat through the Maritimes. There's a few that hang out in Prince Edward Island. We've got a few in New Brunswick, but the main core area for them to overwinter in Canada anyways is southwest Nova Scotia.
Yeah. Down towards Yarmouth.
Correct, yeah. So down towards Yarmouth and around the other end, going back towards Halifax, if you think of, there's a couple key migratory bird sanctuaries are Port Jolly, Porty Bear, and Sable River. And we're set up for the purpose of helping to better overwinter and provide habitat for these North Atlantic population Canada geese.
Sure.
Those that end up going down to the U.S. Are in the New England states, and our most recent collar data shows them hanging around kind of Long Island north into Massachusetts. So there's a few in Long Island, New York. It's about as far south as our collars get. A bunch of our birds are in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and then Massachusetts. When they leave, they come back through the Maritimes, go up into Newfoundland and Labrador, and rinse and repeat going down through the fall. So we have a big staging portion that show up kind of late September, early October, and they're here until essentially the cold freezes them out. We've got collared birds that are here right till end of seasons, and then some again are overwintering, and those that don't are in New England states. The other main population that we have here are Atlantic flyway resident population. So some people call those temperate geese, some people call them giants, some people call them locals, but they're essentially temperate breeding geese that don't go into the north to reproduce. Some of them will, if they're a failed breeder, they'll take what's called a molt migration, and they'll migrate north to molt, but they don't do any breeding in more northern latitudes. So we have populations here that are in the Maritimes. They're breeding, kind of from northern New Brunswick all the way down to southern Nova Scotia and in PI, but we don't have that resident population nesting in Labrador or in Newfoundland. That resident population is roughly 1 million individuals across the entire Atlantic flyway, and the North Atlantic population birds is around 100,000.
Okay.
So there's a full order of magnitude more of these temperate birds than that North Atlantic population.
So when we're talking about, like, they would overwinter in New England.
Yep. The North Atlantic population's birds do, yeah.
Okay, what about, so when we talk about, when you say the resident geese, are you talking about AP geese? Like,
no. So AP's another
one. Okay, so the resident geese that people are calling giants or whatever, they're also migrating down to New England, we'll say, and overwintering?
So some do. Some of our banning work that we've done, most recently in Prince Edward Island, but we've also put bans out in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in years past. Basically, for harvest returns, anyways, of people shooting bands, about 85% of them are returned in the Maritimes, and then we have roughly 15% that are returned either in Quebec or in kind of the northeastern U.S. states. So kind of from New York through the New England states, some in New Hampshire and into Vermont. But of birds that we're calling residents or temperates, roughly 85% of those are harvested in the Maritimes. So
Okay.
we're producing what we're harvesting that way. That population, again, as a whole, if you take the whole population, which is the entire flyway, it's not just the Maritimes, but that entire population is roughly 1 million birds.
Holy shit.
And there's a good number of them. And
That's a lot.
That reflects from what we put on the landscape in terms of regulations. That's that early Canada season that we have starting September 1st in New Brunswick and running that 15 days, right?
Yeah, that
and then,
10 bird limit.
Yep, 10 bird daily and no possession limit. And that's really to kind of focus on those birds. From a management side too, those are the birds that we hear about that, people are having troubles with in city parks or golf courses or those types of things. Those aren't the migrant populations that are going into Labrador. It's the birds that are here, temperate breeding. Again, they're not going into the north to breed. They're breeding locally. And that early season is really our best way to kind of ensure that harvest is only on that population.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And when we talk about people calling them giants, like for us to identify a goose without calipers, we always knew like a giant Canada goose to have that white patch across their forehead. I don't know if that's I'm not you.
It's
but.
not like, it is a characteristic. I don't want to say that it's kind of like ubiquitous across all giants. It just happens to be a color morph type thing that happens with that strain.
The visor, yeah. And they do tend to be massive
for sure
in the early season, like
big residents.
Yeah.
Totally big birds, and we we use some thresholds. So our talked about calipers for our banding program that we run in the springtime, when we could be also catching temperate nesting geese. At the same time, we have a culmen measurement, which is if you think of a goose's bill, there's a little V where the feathers dip down on the top of the bill.
Yeah.
So from where that point is to the tip of the bill is called the culmen.
Sure.
And that measurement of 55 millimeters or less, we're considering a safe threshold to call that a North Atlantic population bird. And if you're in the field hunting kind of, mid-October onwards, you probably end up seeing some birds that look like they have a real short face.
Yeah.
And that's how it looks in the hand.
Yeah.
So our North Atlantic population birds have a shorter face than those resident birds. And when you have them side by side, it's obvious. But you can't do that at a management level without those measurements, because that band is then tied to how we assess harvest of different populations. So that's why we have to take a little bit extra effort to say, yes, that's this population versus another. But in the field, in the hand, you kind of go this way and your arm drops when you've got a giant, and some of those other birds are smaller. But with that being said, of the subspecies of more Arctic or subarctic nesting geese, North Atlantic population Canadas are the largest of those subspecies.
Oh.
So just to be able to say that the goose looks big, because North Atlantics are actually larger in proportion to some of the others that nest across Arctic areas, it's really tight, because they look size-wise very similar to a temperate nesting Canada goose.
Okay.
So we can't quite look at them and go, oh yeah, that's definitely because they're smaller. You talked about AP geese, so Atlantic population geese nest in northern Quebec in the Ungava Peninsula, and they winter around mostly in the Chesapeake and the Delmar Peninsula, sort of in Maryland area.
So would you figure that based off of where we are on the map, as far as like Carleton County, we'll say my area, would you say that's what we're getting?
So you're in this magical place of
it is magical.
where
Thank you.
Some of these migrations overlap.
Right.
So we've got resident temperate
weird things happen there with birds
that nest there, right? And then we've got North Atlantic population geese that are coming down, and some of our collar work shows them flying, more from, it's most of the western Labrador birds, but they fly, instead of coming down into PEI in the fall, They end up coming down the Gaspé Peninsula, sort of through basically your area into Maine, and then they head into the New England states. And some of those AP birds that have collars, instead of funneling sort of straight down Quebec into upstate New York and then sort of into, Delaware and Maryland, some of them take a bit of a eastern path and kind of hook around through where you are in the Woodstock area.
Right.
So you've got potentially 3 different management populations that are coming, but of the proportion of those, the least likely that you're going to shoot is an AP bird, and you're more likely to be shooting resident birds earlier in the year. And then when North Atlantic population birds show up in kind of early October, they're moving through in a month to 2 months through, but we don't have a lot of collar retention around Woodstock the same way that we do in PEI or Nova Scotia. So the birds coming through you tend to kind of push through down kind of by mid to late November. And then anything that you've got after that, I can't say for sure, but they're likely to be more resident birds than they are migrant birds. And you probably see that in how they react when you're in the fields, right? You got to maybe put a little bit more effort into tricking them later into the season than when you've got that magic window of all the migrants coming through and there's birds all over the place.
Yeah, it just depends on the year. Like we spoke about before, we pay attention to this stuff because, there's got to be more to it, right? And for me, it's always been very interesting, the biology of Canada geese, because, to lay one on this desk and it be the size of a black duck, and then the next one is the size of this whole desk. And some of them, I had pictures there with the white underneath of their wings. Like, all of those things are very neat, right? Their bill length, the way that they work, very vertical. Like, I remember telling you that the only time I ever saw geese that would work so vertical is in Ontario. Like, just that. They'd come in when they saw a spot they wanted to go, almost like a
helicopter.
Like something you'd see in Texas, like those actual lessers or whatnot. And I don't know what they are. I'm not going to say that it's a lesser. Some of them, you can tell it's a cackler. Its beak is super small, 25 millimeters or whatever their beak size is.
Yep.
But it's always been interesting to me to see this progression over the years. Like when I was a kid, they were all big. So probably a lot of that resident population. And now, just as the season goes on, you can see even certain flocks are a lot of smaller birds. And then but we notice, to be quite honest, it's a lot of bigger ones early. Like all of those resident geese that we shoot early in the year are all monsters. Sure. And we would see some of them in November, but we have a lot of migrating geese coming through.
Yeah, and that's what you would kind of, being on my side of the conversation here and kind of immersed in some of that, I want to say that's what you would expect, because maybe not everybody would expect that, but I would expect that. Like what you're telling me is what makes sense with how the progression of migration comes and where some of these other populations might be pushing around. And, you talked about, phone call we had earlier, we were talking a bunch about snow geese and just the numbers of snow geese this fall on the landscape, either ones that I saw, while being out or just hearing from people about snow geese. And you talk about all these different geese that you see coming through. Sometimes if you go backwards in the calendar and you think about the weather and what the winds were doing, like all those snow geese coming out of Quebec were here on a super heavy west wind. It just howled out of the west through Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And again, for me, as a waterfowl biologist, it makes perfect sense that through Thanksgiving, man, did we see a lot of snow geese? That doesn't surprise me at all. And if you get into, maybe either, smaller birds or, birds are just acting different, I always end up thinking back a couple of days and go, okay, what was the weather like 5 days ago? And then you're like, oh, it was hard, northeast winds. Well, maybe that blew some of these, smaller nesting geese off of Greenland. The one thing that was a theory, it's called Bergman's rule. And the idea was that for a species, as you went north with their populations, in theory, the animal got bigger because it needed more energy to get through the cold.
Okay.
So if you think of white-tailed deer are a really good example of this. It's not a hard, fast rule, which when you go to school and learn about biology, there's always an exception to somebody's theory out there. But
100%.
Anyways,
Yeah.
Bergman had this theory that as you went further north in a species range, individuals will get bigger. So if you think of white-tailed deer in the Florida Keys that are smaller than a German Shepherd,
Yep.
and you think of white-tailed deer in northern Canada, pick a province,
Yeah.
that are pushing 300 pounds, that's kind of Bergman's rule applied. The further north you go, the bigger the thing gets.
Yeah.
That happens with snow geese. Greater snow geese come out of the highest parts of Canadian Arctic.
Yeah.
And they're bigger than lesser snow geese. But it's opposite with Canada's. Further north you get with Canada's breeding range, the smaller they get. So lessers, cacklers, all those things are coming out of the high north in Canada, and our giants are in the temperate area, or the temperate breeders are the biggest Canadas. So it's just kind of a neat thing, but if you get small birds showing up, you know they're coming out of the north because they're not from a local area, because the local area birds are big.
Yeah, like we, over the years, I mean, like I said to you, we have a lot of white fronts come through. I mean, that's a strange deal. And we pick them out. Like, I mean, you not only can you hear them, but you can see them a lot of times.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of times, the funny thing about them is it wouldn't matter whether there was 300 or 400 Canadas. The second that thing yodels, you can hear it.
Oh, totally.
Over all of them, especially when you're in an area that doesn't have them. You know?
Oh, definitely. It was my second year undergrad. I was part of the wildlife biology club at Guelph, and I was, I think, the only guy in the club that did any hunting, but I had a few friends that were really big into bird watching. And we were down edge of Lake Ontario in Hamilton looking at overwintering ducks, and they got just a huge diversity down there. And we're walking along, and just like you said, I heard, this high calling speck. And I was like, oh, it's a specklebelly, it's a specklebelly. And no one knew what the heck a specklebelly was because they're all bird watchers,
right,
and they call it a greater white-fronted goose.
Yeah.
And so by the time we got to the end of the conversation of that a speck meant a white front, and all of a sudden they're freaking out because this is like a super rare bird at that time of the
now
year.
Now they get it.
And I'm like, oh, it just flew over there, not really thinking about it because I, heard the speck calling. And so, like, I mean, I know what you mean. They stick out. And again, like, kind of coming east, there's less and less of them. But there's, has been in the past anyways. I've been to Grand Manan and in mid-January recently because some of our winter banding programs changed, but there was a couple years in a row when we were over there, and there's half a dozen to a dozen white fronts that are wintering on Grand Manan.
Yeah,
and
they're
coming from eastern edges of their range, and it's just again a fringe one that has found a place that keeps them alive, and because geese are so honed into being good parents, that group would have gotten there at some point, maybe with a clutch that they got down there. They've got all their goslings, and they find Grand Manan, and there's not a lot of snow. There's a bunch of grass, and it's like, hey, we're safe here.
Yeah.
And then let's come back next year because we're still safe. Mm. And, you get some of that happens, and birds do a little bit of a funky migration that's different than the bulk of the population, but, they're just moving through. And again, your area is on the fringe of a bunch of pathways that these different populations are taking, and it doesn't surprise me that you've got a neat diversity of geese that you see.
You just never know. Like we've had barnacles come through and pinkfoots, and could have been like we've had a few pinkfoots come through. Could have been a gray leg at one point. We weren't sure. It was just a little bit too far away, but it didn't look like a pinkfoot as close as they are. It was bigger.
Yeah. Okay.
And I feel like a gray leg's a little bit bigger than a pinkfoot, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is, and I mean the other thing with gray legs, like that's the kind of the stock goose for a lot of the domestics. Right. Is a gray leg goose.
That's kind of what it looked like. Yeah. Funny looking legs on it, and it was just a little too far away to tell.
And you sometimes, whatever the case is for why domestic can still fly, they end up getting out and that kind of thing. So I mean, it again, they can be on the landscape, but in terms of pinkfoots, like they're eBird is a good online citizen science bird reporting tool that people use, for science programs. People that are out, doing work for groups are uploading data to eBird, and then people that are bird watchers are uploading to eBird, and so I end up looking at that site, and you get certain rare birds that pop up on a separate list, and
Right.
We get a pink-footed goose. So it's been 3 or 4 years now in a row, I think, that comes through the Salisbury area, just west of Moncton.
Yeah, there's
And,
one in Yarmouth right now.
Yeah, I believe it. But it's tied. This pinkfoots is tied to those Greenland collared Canadas that are coming through, both
Okay.
with satellite collars, but also just alphanumerics.
Huh.
And there's pictures on eBird of this pinkfoot in with a bunch of collared birds that have been marked by the researcher that's from Denmark. Tony Fox is his name. He's a professor over there, and he's got a bunch of work that he does on Greenland. But that's where those collars are coming out of, and pinkfoot's nest over there too. So again,
Yeah.
it's not surprising that they're tied to each other, but it's just that bird's tied in with those birds coming out of Greenland, and it's several years in a row now that you can almost look at a calendar and say, yeah, someone's going to show up and report a pinkfoot somewhere, and inevitably it happens.
I wanted to just touch on again, just so that I'm clear. When I'm thinking about the way the country's laid out, so on the eastern side are your NAP geese.
Yep.
Okay.
Farthest east,
East.
and north becomes our NAPs.
And
So
then that's like, what'd you say, 100 and some thousand?
it's roughly 100,000.
Okay. And then you've got the million or so population of the resident geese.
Correct.
And what did you call them again?
So they're Atlantic flyway resident
Okay.
population, but it's a problem with the terms that carry through. So people refer to those as temperates,
Yes.
because they breed in a temperate environment. They're not migrating north, or residents. And so they're a resident population and across the whole flyway. So that's not just the Maritimes, but they're roughly 1 million birds.
Okay. And then the other ones were AP geese.
Correct,
And those would
yeah.
be the most western in our flyway.
In our flyway, yes, and they're coming out of northern Quebec, and so the Ungava Peninsula up into sort of James Bay and Hudson's Bay there, that stretch.
And would that be mostly like flying down over Maine to get to, would that be sort of a straight shot migration?
Yeah, but they're more inland of Maine. So they kind of come out of Quebec. You think of where Montreal is,
Yep.
and they head straight south
Okay.
to the coast.
All right. So they're not far from us at all.
Not. I mean, as the crow flies, as they say, no, and to expect that you might see those, it's not unexpected. But the core of that migration is not in the Maritimes at all.
Okay. Right. So now I understand what you're saying, because I can picture the map in my head because we look at them enough. And Montreal is sort of northwest of me, northwest
Yep.
of where I'm sitting.
Yeah. So if you think of the province of Quebec, the Ungava Peninsula sort of sticks up like an arrowhead
Yeah.
into the Arctic.
Right.
And they're just below on either side of that arrowhead is where they're nesting.
Yep.
And they kind of come down from that arrowhead, but it's not necessarily straight. They might take sort of a horseshoe trajectory kind
Yeah.
of thing, and on the eastern side of that trajectory, you guys sit in Woodstock.
Okay. That's cool. I appreciate that, because I've always wondered. So remember that you said it's a magical place, okay?
It is.
Don't forget that
Yeah,
when you're
okay.
wanting to do research. Let's
Yeah,
go to
for
Woodstock.
sure.
I've always thought it was this magical place.
Yeah. But I mean, in terms of where
There's geese there right now, man.
Those populations, and their trajectories overlap. Like, there's there's not a lot of APs coming through. There's probably fair numbers of North Atlantic population birds, and then the temperate breeding birds, they might make a regional movement because they're frozen out or the fields get too covered in snow and ice. But as soon as they can get back in again, they'll be up there and they don't have to go that far away.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. No, I've always wondered that. So that's something that we could actually look into, because I'll remember that you said that where they are up in that. Is there a specific area up there when you're saying that arrowhead? Like, what would be a landmark that you could look at, or do you know right off the top of your head for AP geese?
What I don't want to do is mispronounce the names.
Oh, okay. No, that's all
of
good
the
then.
communities. Yeah, I'm gonna missay it, and then that might refer to another area. But it's kind of the base of the Ungava Peninsula is where those birds are.
We'll check that out.
If you look kind of essentially straight north of Montreal, you're gonna see that. Or if the person that's the youngest in the room has a map on his telephone, we could show it to you right now.
That would be you, son, on your device.
So if you've got Google Earth or Google Maps, you can pull up on there. I can find it on there real fast.
There's Hunt Stand.
Okay.
He's going to show us where we need to take our ultralight plane, Rowan.
So
that's where we'll take our last stand.
That's Quebec. This is the Ungava Peninsula, and that's kind of that arrowhead that I'm talking
so
about.
like the land is shaped like an arrow.
Yep, and it's really this area right here.
Okay.
That AP population comes out of.
Yeah.
And those birds head down, and they more or less come straight down, and the bulk of them winter right here.
Oh, yeah.
In this area. So again,
right around Jeff.
For that to come this way, it's not that hard to imagine that some of them could go about that direction like this.
I gotcha.
And that goes right over you.
Yep.
Just as they come into, I was on Waterfowl Technical Committee meetings today, and colleagues in Ontario that are around Ottawa were talking about all the AP geese coming through Ottawa right now. So Eastern Ontario gets a bunch of them, and that's this kind of flight going in that direction.
Oh, okay.
And then, the lion's share of them go straight up and down, but there's
sense.
always a bit of variation, and
See that, Ron?
it's kind of like, the flyways idea, right? We've got an Atlantic, Mississippi, Central Pacific flyway. There's landscape features that are out there that separate them. Some of them are like the Rocky Mountains or the Mississippi River that are quite big things on the landscape that are a good reference point, but that doesn't mean that every single duck follows the flyway that they're supposed to be in.
Sure. I think, like we talked about earlier, the wind definitely plays a thing there. And I guess Montreal is certainly, now that I look at that again, it's definitely more westerly from where we are. But now that you show me that map, that definitely makes sense that if they were coming down that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if they're coming down on the, the eastern side of what their, let's call it the traditional flyway is, and there's all of a sudden a strong west wind, that pushes that flock out over you.
Easy, yeah.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Do you think the St. Lawrence has anything to do with them like acting as like a barrier? Like they wouldn't cross that maybe?
Oh, no. I think it just is just kind of what over repeated migrations, it becomes like instinctual of where they're going.
They just don't come this far east.
They just don't come this far east, and we have to think back, a long period of time too, with like the last glaciation of where a whole bunch of the world was covered in ice, and some of these populations were separated by a glacier. A really good example of that is blue-faced snow geese and white snow geese. People thought those were two different species for a very long time, but they were just really isolated based on the last glaciation. And that genetics of those blue geese weren't intermixing the same way with white geese as they are now because the glaciers aren't in the way. So some of this is really a tradition that's, tens of thousands of years. And, we as managers want to kind of, spread those into individual populations for the sake of management because they go to such specific spots. Hunting pressure can do a lot to that population at a certain time. Right, but at the big level, they are all just Canada geese.
Right,
they just have had drivers that the environment has put on them to do some of these unique migrations, and has separated that out over so many generations that the population goes to a different place than another population that we might reference.
So we're talking about Canada geese, and I do have a couple more questions about that. On obviously on our licenses or in the specifics on limits and things like that, it says Canada geese and cackling geese.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that people have asked questions about that a lot in the past. How come it specifically says cackling geese instead of just Canada geese?
Yeah. So with advancements in genetic technologies and work that's been done, genetically speaking, cackling geese and Canada geese are two different species.
No way.
And so for the way that we approach our regulations, because cackling geese aren't here in a way that we have sort of a population level impact, by listing cackling goose, that makes the person that's hunting geese legal in a, kind of like a legal sense. So if we had a separate species,
right,
that became known through science, and we didn't list that, if you had harvested a cackling goose and that's not listed in the regulation, then there could be an infraction that's there. And I believe if you read further, it says, and all other geese combined. So that's why you can harvest those other species that we've talked about, whether that's that pink-footed goose or a snow goose or a white front.
Yeah.
And we
or a barnacle.
Correct. And we put that into the regulation to allow people that are out hunting geese to remain legal should something that looks like a Canada goose but ends up being a cackler. That's something that, not everybody's a waterfowl biologist that's lying in the field, and that's not a reason to have an infraction like that either. There's not a population impact for the handful of cacklers that are shot in Atlantic Canada.
Yeah, I guess and that's news to me, because I knew that there was cacklers, and I knew that they were sort of almost their own family,
mm-hmm.
but I didn't know that they were a different species altogether, that they weren't a Canada goose.
Yep.
Huh.
So, and again, that's just, separation of time where, we call it speciation, but you have a bird that ends up somewhere, right, that gets isolated and then breaks into different species. So the great example of that is the Darwin finches with all their different sized bills for different foods that they eat. The original bird is one species, and it evolved through many generations into multiple different species based on selection of different food types.
So that would be like Canada geese with the separate subspecies, and there's lots of speculation on. There's 14. There's
sure.
7. Yep. Like,
yep.
Do you have any theory on that?
I don't. I'm not a genetic specialist by any means that way, and I think again, I kind of mentioned that managers and scientists want to look to classify things, and some of that's based on very logical things like migration and wintering and keeping with those that a subpopulation does. And over time, if you're separated from the other group, there's going to be a subspecies level change in your genetics. But when you boil that all back to the top, it's still the main species, right? So, we've got Brenta canadensis maxima and interior and all that sort of thing. And,
sure,
they've separated out enough where there's some subspecies level differences, but in the end, it's a Canada goose.
Yeah, just different sizes, basically.
Correct. But when it comes to between Canadas and cacklers, there's a genetic difference enough where that's considered two different species.
Huh. That's really neat. I never realized that. Really cool. Now, I know over on PEI, their season towards the end is 3.
Yep.
And ours is still 5.
Yep.
What's the reason for that over there?
So it's about where the birds are and which the population is there. So, we've talked about that North Atlantic population are separate, and there's roughly 100,000 of those compared to that million temperate breeders, or resident population birds. And where those birds are at certain times of the year are a little bit different.
Right.
And PEI concentrates a lot of North Atlantic population birds later into the season.
Okay.
And
makes
so
sense.
The idea behind it is that to extend a season to 107 days, but keep the overall total harvest the same, you have to reduce the daily limit.
Right.
And the idea is that to allow for that 107-day season, we can allow 107 days of 5 birds, because the harvest of that NAP population would be too great.
Yeah.
At that time.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. We're enjoying the 107-day season.
Yeah.
That's for sure. This was I believe, the first year for it, correct? I
It
mean,
is
this was the first time
in
we
recent
could.
time. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the goose seasons with the addition of the early season has been 107 days for a number of years, and that's why those dates you wouldn't have seen change. But yeah, the duck season was not at 107 days, and so we had that opportunity based on what the populations were doing to increase that, and some of our work that we do that maybe people partake in but really don't understand how it's applied. So what I'm thinking of here is the National Harvest Survey.
Yeah.
So when you go and whether it's online or still at the post office, buy your migratory game permit and your duck stamp, you can click a box to say whether you're interested or not in being part of a volunteer survey.
Yeah.
And that volunteer survey comes in two parts. One of those is essentially like a effort survey. So you get a calendar, and on that calendar you indicate the number of days that you hunted and how many birds you harvested on those days. And the other half is a part survey, where you end up with some specialized envelopes with instructions of how to remove a wing, or for geese, you take off the tail fan and the outer primaries.
The wing and tail survey.
That's the wing and tail survey.
Rowan's done that a few times.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So that information comes together for us in two ways. So the wing and tail survey gives us the species composition that are harvested throughout the season. So, early goose season, you would expect that should be roughly all Canada geese, right? We might get a white front tail fan or something like that, but really for the most part out here, we've got 100% Canada geese being submitted. And then through the duck season, early season, you see a greater diversity in species because wood ducks and teal and widgeon and gadwall and all of those are still here. And then later in the season, it kind of ties mostly to mallards, American black ducks, ring-winged teal, and then coastal areas, some of the sea ducks. And so we get an idea of what the species composition is. We ID those to age and sex. So we also know how many of those birds harvested are adult males versus juvenile females. And some of that plays back into our population models. And the effort survey gives us an understanding of how many people are in the field for the number of days, as well as the amount of effort that they put in, both in, again, total number of days of field, but also number of birds harvested. And then through some modeling, we take both of that information and put it together, and that gives us a breakdown of what the average harvest looks like for a game permit holder in New Brunswick or Saskatchewan or Canada. And that applies so that we know how much hunting pressure is out there. We can sort of estimate roughly how many birds would be harvested throughout an entire season. And then we can use that to make decisions based on what populations can support.
So it's pretty important, realistically, that guys, if they get that hunters when they get that information to do it up and send it back in.
Totally, and I
to the best of your knowledge.
Well, no. I mean, my hands are involved in it, so it's very much to the best of everybody for people to participate. And the two things that the hunting community can do to really help us monitor on the harvest side is participate in that survey and report your bans. Because we use all that information directly into setting regulations with season dates and bag limits. And we did that for the increase to 107 days, as well as the reduction in restrictions on black ducks. That information was used to make those decisions. So it really is important. And if someone's out there thinking, maybe should click that box next time, or, I should report that ban, please do, because we use that information annually, and it's super important.
Yeah, I mean, for us to go the 15 days into January, there's been years in the past where everything would be frozen. Mm-hmm. It would be tough for us to find a place to go. But in recent years, things have been pretty open. There's some ducks that sort of seem to winter in our area, a few different spots. Yep. And man, January was awesome. Like it was a welcome season for us, so hopefully, if things continue that way, it'll be.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's about providing opportunities. So like the average waterfowler in Canada is out somewhere between 1 and 4 times, and they don't harvest what our old possession limit of 3 daily a bag would be. So 18 birds.
Right.
And that's the national, like across Canada, the average waterfowler is out maybe once, maybe twice, and gets a handful of birds.
In a season?
In a season.
Yes, sir. Wow.
And we get that information from that harvest survey that we were just talking about.
Okay.
And where I'm going with that is that I think this 107-day season really allows the opportunity for the average guy to open up more.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Let's say whatever the reason is that their, personal life, work life, whatever,
Harvest, farming.
doesn't allow that. Extending to 107-day seasons, maybe, the second week of January is not everybody's cup of tea, but for that one person that maybe that doubles their season opportunity, I think that's where we can see it. And then for, people like yourselves that are out a lot, it's providing that opportunity that's there. And again, in a responsible and using conservation to its fullest kind of way, that resource is there. And, we're managing it with an understanding that these populations are stable and it can support that additional couple of weeks for, again, the few people that are going to be on the landscape.
Well, I think that makes a great point, because when you look at it that way, I mean, why are we extending the season? Well, to give hunters more opportunity, right? I mean, that's what we all want, is more opportunity. And everybody works. A lot of people work seasonal jobs. And when are your jobs the busiest? For most people, certainly in our area, in the fall. Mm-hmm. And if you work in fisheries, like in the fall, they have October and then that's it. So when January comes and if things slow down, people have a chance to get out. You're right after the holidays. Lots of people are still possibly on vacation, or things aren't as busy at work. And if there's some opportunity around, well, hey, I mean, nowadays nobody can, whether you're out there hunting in January or not, nobody can really kick on the fact that we're getting more of a hunting season, because it's not a going thing. Mm-hmm. As we all know, with firearms and hunting in general, to get more opportunity to hunt is a pretty welcome addition for all of us.
Definitely. And I mean, there's, the age demographic of where, the hunting community is being, sort of a older demographic, and, I don't want to say aging out, but, working towards that, providing that flexibility and that extended season dates for that next generation, makes for a lot more opportunity. If you're thinking of people that are school aged, you're coming into Christmas break and those kinds of things, that's extending beyond almost a week of what would have been there a couple of years ago when things ended on December 31st. So it really opens that opportunity envelope up, I think, even just a little bit more, and that supports the people that are out there enjoying the resource. I
thought it was great myself. You nailed another good point about when we were involved in Delta Waterfowl, pretty heavy running the chapter and stuff. I mean, there's, although it may seem like it in some areas, there's not more and more hunters every year. It's like you say, it is, the average age is not getting younger.
No.
Which is unfortunate, but to offer more opportunity that way, to give anybody, especially people of a younger generation, more opportunity, I mean, that just makes sense. It definitely shows you're on the right channel there.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because like at my school now, I don't know a single other person that duck or goose hunts as hard as I do. Like, everybody will go grouse hunting every once in a while, or maybe shoot a deer, try to shoot a deer, but nobody duck or goose hunts anymore.
Yeah.
So
it's
kind of, I don't know, like more people are getting into it, we've seen over the years, but like high school age, there's not as many kids into it. And opening it up, like a lot of my buddies want to try to go with me this fall, because early season was opened up to September 1st till the 15th, so before school starts. So we get that week where we can go out. Before, it always started on the first day of school, which I hated, but that, like, opening that up allows for those kids that wouldn't normally be able to get out because of school to get out and have an opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean,
participate.
from like the just to tie that back to the management side and the biology, like with having the early goose season to target sort of those resident population birds, by moving it forward into September, from our collar data shows that the migrant populations aren't here yet, for the most part, right? So we're ensuring that harvest is happening on those resident birds,
Right.
Which is, again, you maybe don't get a full understanding for what that logic is going into those decisions. That gets put forward in our regulatory process, but to be able to talk through kind of some of the decisions that go into that hopefully helps make those ideas clear. And if it benefits younger people that hadn't had that same opportunity, then that's a win on top of it.
Well, it's twofold then, right? Because I mean, I know that that's when it started, but just you bringing that back up, because you're right in the middle of that, makes a lot of sense, right? Because then again, that offers more opportunity to that generation that there's really no other hunting seasons that are going on. Maybe archery bear, I'm not sure, but
and then woodcock starts around that
the
time.
16th. Yeah, it starts the 16th.
Yeah, so there you go. I mean, you're right into it, So, I think that's a good point. And bringing to light, like you said, the reason that some of those decisions are made. I mean, back when I was heavy with Delta, I know that there was like a Atlantic flyway meeting or something that happens here. I'm sure you're part of that.
Yep.
And I know that Jim Fisher would come down, and I don't know if he still does.
He does, yeah.
He still does, Jim's a great guy for that meeting, and I know that's where a lot of that stuff was talked about. So it's good that's part of why I wanted to do this too, just to sort of get the Paul Harvey version, like the rest of the story from your end.
Right.
Like, this is the research, and this is why we do this, and why we're making these decisions. So
so the committee you're referencing is called the Atlantic Migratory Game Bird Technical Committee.
okay,
That's comprised of our waterfowl and data management staff at Canadian Wildlife Service. The 4 Atlantic provinces contribute staff, as well as our NGO partners, so like Delta and Ducks Unlimited Canada, and then our Indigenous partners also participate in those meetings. And we use those meetings to talk about the baseline management that we're doing, so surveys, banding, harvest survey, that type of thing, breeding surveys in the springtime. But also convey some of the work that we're doing, more on a research side, applied to management, like the net collar work with the North Atlantic population, Canada geese, or the backpack work with mallards and black ducks, and also allows that opportunity to talk through proposals for changes to the game bird regs and seasons, and we do that on a every 2-year cycle.
What are we coming up? Just to interrupt you quick.
Yep.
Are we in year 2 of your changes last time?
We will be going into year 2 this fall.
Right.
So the proposal timeline will be coming up here, at which typically it's the provincial hunting and fishing groups that convey those changes. But we do have mechanisms for allowing those changes to be proposed, and then it's that technical committee where we discuss that, and that's where probably that reference came up when you printed off the proposals document, because all the proposals go through that committee for evaluation, and then if they're going to go forward like the 107 days did, they roll through our federal process that takes roughly a year to do, and because of that, we've adapted this every 2-year approach to ensure that that's done fully and properly, and that we can be responsibly putting that out, and helps to keep regulations a bit more consistent too, that there aren't changes happening every year.
Yeah, so people are you're trying to save people.
And I mean, I think I know from talking with people and even myself, having a relatively speaking consistent opening dates, closing dates, bag limits, those types of things to the best of our abilities, really helps with, I think, people's enjoyment and understanding. It's a straightforward regulations, but also like compliance promotion, right? If things are consistent, people will remember that it's it's 6 ducks, and that's
Right.
not something that becomes a concern because that's changing every other year or what have you.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. So, yeah, that's really good information, really, and again, you're trying to do this for hunters. You're trying to make regulations so that it's easy for people to remember, that you're giving people the most opportunity, things like that. So that definitely makes sense. I know that you wanted to talk about black ducks.
Yep.
You might have a thing or two you want to say about
Yeah,
them.
for sure. So because we've recently changed that opportunity, we work quite closely and good partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for managing black duck populations. We have a international agreement where we jointly manage that population. To put it kind of in perspective, for most populations in Canada, Canadians harvest roughly 10% of the total harvest in North America.
Right.
Whereas the rest of that typically is happening in the U.S. There's a few species where we're close to parity with equal harvest, and one of those is American black ducks. And so this agreement allows us to try to share harvest essentially 50-50 between Canada and the U.S. And all the data that we collect, so spring breeding pair surveys, our banding data, harvest data, that data that comes from people reporting their band numbers, as well as the parts and effort survey, the wing and tail survey that people participate in. All that information is put into a integrated population model, and it's updated every year from current year's information, and that projects essentially a year forward. And what that does is allow us to understand where harvest packages should be set for the U.S. and Canada. And at this point in Canada, based on our ability to harvest with numbers of people that are out and the time that they're out there, we're at a liberal package. And we had been in a liberal package for a couple of years, and we were actually only harvesting at a moderate rate. So what it told us was that there was flexibility within the population to increase harvest in Canada and not have that be impactful at a population level. And through that's where we were able to propose and then implement the 107 days, but also extend that to black ducks with no late season restrictions that had been there in the past.
Yeah.
And we have put this in place with the idea that we, again, getting this information coming in, we can assess how that harvest looks and what the population's doing moving forward. And we have the flexibility within our regulatory cycle to be able to make changes should we see that harvest has potentially gotten too high, or if harvest hasn't changed, we know that limit and that season is not affecting the population in a negative way. And so it's very, we just talked about regulations being consistent and moving forward and how that's nice, and it really is, but there's a lot of really fluid moving parts in the background that probably, not everybody necessarily gets to appreciate, and unless you kind of, print off the proposals document and read through and get the summary of what decisions are in the background, you don't really see that when you see, I can still harvest 6 mallards for 107 days this year like I could last year, right?
Yeah.
But all of that's still going on in the background, and we know that those limits and those seasons are being conducted in a sustainable way because of all the work that we're doing. And so we apply that to black ducks. We have increased our opportunity here, and then the other two jurisdictions are Quebec region and Ontario region that are our Canadian primary harvesters of American black ducks, and so they've also changed their seasons in this go round for increasing that opportunity. And you think about extending seasons later on. The bird composition that's here, American black ducks are a bread and butter duck for hunters in Atlantic Canada. And so to not have that restriction, increase that opportunity, a couple more weeks, depending on where you are on the map, again, provides that chance for people that might be out, and, helps with increasing hunter satisfaction and, people enjoying their times of field. And, I think that's all at a management level, very, very positive things to be doing.
No question. And again, when you said where you are on the map, like when you think about the majority of where waterfowl hunting happens in the Maritimes, like most of the history and most of the culture, which I've been talking about on this podcast a lot lately, regardless of where I go around the Maritimes, most of the culture and history is on the coast.
Sure.
And most of the people and most of the population is on the coast.
Yep.
Like we're kind of, like you said, magical oddity up where we are.
River Valley.
Yeah, so it's kind of like salt and pepper where we are. Whereas when the closer you get to the coast, like it's rare to see mallards really bobbing around out in the salt water.
Yep.
You know, that when you go to like Yarmouth right now or that area or anywhere is real coastal like that, it's mostly black ducks, you know. And so that makes perfect sense, right? You're trying to give people more opportunity, and you know, if you go out and the you see 20 flocks, we'll say, and you know 19 and a half of them are black ducks, and you can only shoot 3 or 4, like it's a pretty short day. But if you can, you know, fill your limit with black ducks, well,
sure.
And the population, like, because I read your report this spring and it made a lot of sense to me. You know, here's the harvest data and here's how many we should be shooting, and when it was, you know, at 6, we don't think we're going to get into that, and it's going to be okay. Well, then,
and it's not so much about should be shooting, right? It's about the opportunity for the population to support that level of harvest, right? Like, you know, we're not setting these things for you know, kind of reaching a quota type idea. It's about that, you know, how we're modeling out harvest and you know, harvest rate is supported by the population that's there right now. So, you know, moving forward, you know, I can't, you know, look to say that this will be the set from, you know, today moving forward, you know, onwards, because information's coming in all the time, and that's
nature
kind
is
of
what it is, you know?
Yeah, but it's also like the robustness of the model and how we use it that allows for that flexibility. Because, you know, if you looked at it the other way and there was maybe less you know, confidence in what the model's putting out, you know, we're doing this in a, you know, a conservative based mind frame where conservation's primary. And in that situation, you might suggest less, because you know then that harvest is not at a level where it would affect population. But I think we have a really good understanding. You know, the data is currently showing us we have really stable populations for what we're doing. And again, all those pieces play into us having that understanding. So again, people listening, report your bands, participate in the National Harvest Survey. And, you know, we are out there doing the other pieces that all fit together. And I think we've got a real decent understanding right now of where we're at. And stable populations are good things. And, you know, we've got that opportunity to be flexible right now.
And I think we're kind of lucky here in this flyway, because when they do those nesting habitat maps, you know, with the colors, where how much water do you have, basically they rate you by color.
Yep.
Over on this side of the country, it would be rare for our aquifers to be dry.
Correct.
Like we're quite wet here.
Yep.
You know, and I can only imagine if it were this way in Saskatchewan and Alberta. You know what I mean? Imagine if it was that way in Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
Like the water level's always there. The potholes
definitely
are full. Holy.
But there is one fun biological thing about that is a major difference. So we have lots of water, which is great, but our energy input coming out of that is relatively low. They're not highly productive wetlands. So in the prairie situation, in the wet-dry cycles, all the nutrients that goes in when the water's there, it doesn't get exposed to air and decompose. So that wet-dry cycle allows that energy to be exposed to oxygen. It breaks down, and then when the water comes back, it releases all that nutrients.
Right.
And so the prairies are really boom and bust.
Right.
But when they're booming, they are booming big time, because all that energy's there, and they just produce ducks. Where we have really a nice, you know, you want to feel about being in a consistent landscape. We've got good amount of water. That water doesn't necessarily have a lot of energy in it, so we don't have the same density of breeding waterfowl that are in the prairies. You know, black ducks are roughly at 1 pair per square kilometer on the landscape throughout their eastern range, which isn't a very high density.
Right.
But because that habitat's relatively stable, there is returning opportunity every year. Those ducks go back because they're not waiting for the boom and bust. They
Right.
just don't have a gas pedal. It's just sort of rolling forward because that energy is not super, super rich when you compare it to other wetland types in the country.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess I wouldn't have thought of it like that because, we, in the past, you would think, like, we have so much water, you would think that there would be way more birds because they don't have near as much water as we do.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, there's a ton of feed out there and stuff, but
Yeah.
even on years when they don't have a lot of water, they're still the biggest flyways out there.
Yep.
So that's something that's always been in my head. I'm always like, we always seem to, it never seems to be vary too much here. I mean, it can be over wet and it could be a little more dry, but you would think because of that we would have way more birds. But it makes more sense if you're saying there's not as much energy.
Yeah, it's energy at certain times, right? It's you can be on a landscape where the energy produces more eggs because you've got the energy to lay those eggs, and then when those eggs hatch, there's enough invertebrates and wetland plants to feed all those ducklings. You end up producing more. So they have to wait for that right condition to show up, and when it does, they can really pump themselves out. But out here we've got consistently available water that's at a lower energy level in terms of its productivity, but the birds that are here have a relatively reliable nesting opportunity, and really it's other things like how wet is it in May and June, for when ducklings are coming out of the egg, and on the landscape, if it's super cold and wet, that's hard on small ground nesting birds. You think of grouse and cycles that way. Super wet springs don't produce a lot of grouse because it's really hard on those chicks to make it through that small stage when they really can't thermoregulate. They need their mother to protect them and keep them warm. Same kind of thing for ducklings. So if we have, good consistent water with, fair to nice springs, it's good conditions for us to have a pretty good production in Atlantic Canada.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about eiders,
Okay.
if you're willing to share on that a bit. And the point that you just made reminded me of that. When I think about ducklings and chicks and the factors that they have to face from zero to when they're big enough to kind of survive some cold weather and get away from predators and things like that, the ones that have it the hardest have to be eiders. Growing up on, the salt water and all the predators that are beneath and above,
Yeah. I mean, they're just adapted to a different system. But I mean, with that being said, like ducks are oftentimes not necessarily important to the predator's year. So you think of black ducks are nesting at a certain point of the year. That's not a very big timeline in a coyote or bobcat's annual cycle. But those predators are super important on the duck.
Yeah.
Right? And
No question.
And if you think of what a duck is and their reproductive strategy where they try to reproduce, they lay somewhere between 10 and 15 eggs. They're trying to pump a whole bunch of them out in 1 year because the average duck doesn't live longer than a year. And if you take it from a duckling through to living a year, about 80% of those ones die, whether that's from predation, disease, or other sources of mortality. But those that live through that year, they essentially have one good opportunity to reproduce, and they try to put as many out of them as they can. So duck clutches are really big. They do their best to raise all those ducklings to independence, and then if that female lives another year, she'll obviously do it again, but the chances that she lives, multiple years are pretty small because there's so much out there on the landscape that are eating ducks.
Right.
And, it sort of is middle of the road when you think of Canada geese. They live through that first year. Canada goose can live a very, very long time because not a lot can eat an adult Canada goose at a rate at which it's really significant. So they've got a smaller clutch. They put a lot of effort into raising those goslings to independence, because if they live through that first year, they've got a really good chance of being alive again next year.
How long would they normally live?
So we have recent band recoveries directly, like where we've recaptured geese. We caught a North Atlantic population bird this past April that had a 19-year-old band on it and was banded as an adult, which means it's at least 2 years old. So that bird's in its 20s.
So it's like a horse.
That's not the average. I mean, the average
Jeez.
is somewhere between 8 and 10 years.
Right.
But again, an average duck is, with from banding date, is somewhere around 3 to 5
Okay.
at the most. So they've got quite a significant shorter life than geese do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The one that Steve shot was banded in the spring right before that season. That was out across. You know where he shot that.
Yep.
And then the one that I shot was like 10 years, I think. It was an
Okay.
old duck.
Yep.
But it was from Quebec.
Okay.
So it had moved across the flyway quite a ways to get over here.
Most of the bands that we've got have either been just above us on the other side in Maine
Okay.
lately.
Yep.
New England. We have got a few from Labrador,
Okay.
but it's normally right. I mean, would make sense.
Yep.
Right
Oh, yeah.
here in this flyway. A lot of our geese are from New England
Okay.
that we shoot.
Yep.
October 4th, 2023, in early season, I made the marker later, but in early season we shot 55 of us, shot our limit.
Okay.
And then Brad shot a band, and when we looked it up, it was a 10-year-old Canada from Maine.
Oh, cool.
So
Yeah, very nice. So, but if you think they call a normal distribution of data sort of a bell curve. So you've got 2 wings, comes up to the top of the bell and goes out the other wing. So if we think about duck ages within that bell, the average is right around 3.
Yeah.
So there's a whole bunch that don't make it to 3, and there are a few that make it past 3.
Right.
Geese have a similar distribution, but theirs is, because they live typically longer, is set to a older age bracket. So they're kind of 10 to 15 as an average, but they have a bunch more of them that might live into 20 or something like that, just because they have greater survival rates than ducks do.
Do you think that has something to do with, obviously they're a little bigger, a little more hardy, but they're so damn aggressive. Like if something comes around, like they're not scared to fight. Do you think that's part of the reason why?
Well, I mean, it's
They
what
live?
it's what they're fighting against to some extent, right? Like if you've got, I don't know, a house cat that comes to take on a goose, that's not a fight that the cat's probably going to win.
That's right.
But with a female mallard or something, that cat probably could win that fight.
Yeah.
And so a duck is just in a size bracket where, small predators that are sort of raccoon to coyote sized. There's a lot of those on the landscape when you include, raptors and things like that. And ducks are on the landscape at a time when those things are all also trying to stay alive and feed their families and whatever else. And ducks are there as a prey species. And, it's very similar for, rabbits and grouse and
Sure.
other things that way too. It just, we have a lot more understanding of what's going on based on the science, because it's all come from, really understanding for the sake of management so that, we can harvest these populations.
So when we talk about this whole thing again, we started out on eiders. Have you guys, I'm sure you have, done research on seagulls, like blackback seagulls, and them as a predator on those chicks? Because I know in
Yep.
Graham and Ann, and I talked to Ryan about this, I've seen a fair amount of that on chicks. But even when we were hunting, we had seagulls coming down and like hovering over the decoys and picking at them, and
Yep. Yeah. So it's like, I mean, I guess I'd say for the eider scenario in, the Bay of Fundy area, I think it's a lot of factors all coming together that's leading to a decline, and that we often look for what people call the smoking gun.
Sure.
That one thing that's playing in that we can explain it away from because we changed that thing and all of a sudden there's, more eiders or more geese or whatever it might be. But with how dynamic the ocean system is, that area is increasing in sea temperatures higher than most other of the North Atlantic by a couple of degrees. What that plays into for, the base of the food chain with, plankton and that sort of thing, that leads then to, primary food source of blue mussels, which is, kind of a step up from the base of the food chain. And then we put an eider on top of that. Like there's a lot that can be playing in for food availability. And I think some of that transmitter work that, we're obviously still waiting for a bunch of data to come from to really have conclusions to that project yet. But just initially seeing how birds are going to some of these other colonies and going through the Bay of Fundy, in the fall, but not necessarily sticking around there maybe anymore like they potentially did in the past, has a lot of factors to play into that could be food-based, but also the birds that are remaining to try to reproduce. There's factors that play into with disturbance on offshore islands. A lot of the area of southern and southwestern Nova Scotia has had development on some of their offshore islands. That's not necessarily negative for everything, but for eiders, they don't really like a lot of disturbance in areas that they nest. So areas that maybe were potentially colonies in the past that have been developed or, have had a cottage or a summer house or something put on them that picks away at areas where birds used to breed, and those areas aren't accessible anymore. You think of that there's, all kinds of islands out there,
Sure.
but maybe not every island's the same island as the one beside it. And, the eiders are picking up on that. For the food scenario, like you think of some of the top predators in the system in the Bay of Fundy, like the North Atlantic right whale or the humpback whales that, also aren't coming back in the same way that they had, in the past. And they're, going out to the Gulf of the St. Lawrence to find food. Some of that plays into like what's going on at the, the base of the food chain. And, we have, a lot of people working together to try to understand that, but some of it's also changing so quickly that, we can't necessarily really find that one thing. But I can say, looking at just nesting densities of eiders in the Bay of Fundy, they've reduced, they've been declining on average by roughly 3% since the late 1990s. So, you put a couple decades in there and that's a big percentage decline.
So do you think that there's less eiders or just less eiders here?
I think it's potentially a little bit of both. We're definitely seeing that other colonies are stable or increasing. So population monitoring that happens in the St. Lawrence Islands and some of the areas there in the Gulf are seeing stable and increasing densities. Some of the winter surveys are seeing greater numbers in trends than they had in the past, but we definitely are seeing less eiders in the Bay of Fundy in the springtime. So it could be a combination of both, that they have emigrated elsewhere to find breeding habitat, but it also could be that there's less eiders in the Bay of Fundy, and those things sort of work simultaneously. So it's sort of hard to separate that just from, flying over in a plane or something like that, right? So this transmitter work, again, that still has a long way, or I shouldn't say a long way, but there's a lot of data that's still got to come that'll help to lead toward answers of some of those questions. And it's, trying to take a very complex web of interactions to find that one thing. I don't know that we are going to find that one thing. And this has come up with other duck populations too. Ones that come to mind right off the top of my head are scaup. Scaup are 3.5 million-ish or so, I think, in the last population estimate, and that's somewhere between 1 and 2 million less than it was 30 years ago. But there's not one of these kind of smoking gun things that has explained the scaup reduction in population, but now that it's reduced, it's relatively stable. The same thing happened with American black ducks. We had roughly double the American black ducks in the 70s that we do now. They saw a pretty substantial decline through the 80s into the 90s, and now it's really flatlined and is stable again. but it's stable at a reduced number. And there was, a bunch of theories coming out, and some of those theories all play into each other, whether it's, hybridization with mallards or competition. There's been landscape level changes in certain parts of their nesting area through just human encroachment. And again, similar to eiders, black ducks don't really like a lot of disturbance where they're nesting, but mallards hang out with people pretty well.
Yeah.
And so we've seen a replacement in some of the core breeding area, especially in kind of central Ontario, of black ducks for mallards, but that disturbance is also increased, and mallards are a little bit more adaptable to that. And climate change will play in too, as the tree line goes north and some of those wetlands change over time. Like, we might find more breeding habitat for certain species, but others might see less. So we're kind of pretty dynamic situation right now, but how that all plays into something that we're monitoring, it's not always just an easy answer of one thing, but all of those playing in can apply, and some of them at certain times apply stronger than others. But to kind of find the one fix, it's often not that straightforward.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, there would be a lot of factors at play as to why, but it just, when I saw that sort of time-lapse GPS data over the years, it was, the one I'm talking about, it showed the map there, and it seemed to me, and I've hunted them down in Rhode Island too, in Narragansett Bay, and there's some eiders around, certainly down around that area. And so it just made me sort of beg the question, like, is there less, or is there just less here? So
So again, for some of those areas, where we see in the monitoring that we're doing, some populations are stable or increasing, which would infer that there's not necessarily less eiders at a population level.
Right.
But in terms of the Bay of Fundy, there are definitely less breeding,
less around,
and less around, and because of that, those restrictions have come into place for season dates and bag limits, and that's to help ensure that the breeding eiders that are in the Bay of Fundy still maintain a population to keep reproducing. And then the timing of the dates coincides currently relatively well with when the migrating eiders are coming out of Quebec and Newfoundland, and they sort of dilute the population of Bay of Fundy eiders to harvest.
Okay.
So you're not harvesting just local breeders, you're harvesting migrant birds as well, coming from other colonies that maybe are more stable, stronger, or increasing. Yeah.
Do you think that we'll ever see the February season come back?
In the short term, I would say no. We don't have that opportunity, basically because the February season is only Bay of Fundy eiders that would be being harvested. The transmitter data, at the forend is currently kind of showing that. And that's a breeding population that we don't want to put that added pressure on right now when, there's lots of pressures that are leading to its decline, and it's a pretty significant long-term decline. So there's not a lot of, new information showing to us right now that it's turned around or flatlined.
Okay. So it would have to be a pretty substantial increase.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to necessarily put a meets and bounds or a number on that, but it's something that moving forward, as we're monitoring, we've got that opportunity to present that once it shows itself as being able to be conducted again. But I don't want to say that is in 1 year, 5 years, or that type of thing, because I don't have that answer, and I don't think anybody does.
No, I wouldn't expect you to. I mean, you can't control nature. Geez, maybe there's 500,000 there next year. You wouldn't know. But I mean, for us, I mean, we love the February season. Now we spend it over on Graham and Ann, and obviously we, as you guys have seen, we see eiders over there. But when the eider season got taken away or was gone, it sort of, I think, makes everybody worry. As much as we had the extension, and that's a good thing on other seasons, when that kind of went away, it was like, geez, maybe we're going to lose the whole February season as a whole, right?
Yeah,
we don't want that.
And I mean, to that point, like, I think some of those things, I think shows the ability to use the data that we have for management in an adaptive way.
Yeah.
Right. And we've talked about 107-day seasons and increasing black duck limits because those populations are showing that we can support that amount of harvest. And we're seeing that the eiders currently cannot. And through reduction in harvest, that's something that we can do to help, maintain that population, at a manageable level moving forward that supports harvest. But it doesn't necessarily lead to think that applies to the other species that are there, right? The scoter biology, the bulk of those birds are not being produced in the Bay of Fundy. They're coming out of the Arctic, subarctic boreal forest area. And at this point, those populations appear to be stable.
Longtails got to be good. Wow.
And longtails, and I mean longtails for one, really it's kind of a niche bird.
It's unreal the amount that have been around in the past couple of years.
And it's one that, there's only certain places in North America you can really get under them. And it's a bird that, not everybody's got, either the interest or the gear or the equipment or, whatever to go out and chase those. And I don't think longtails, or I shouldn't say think, I know there's not a large harvest of longtails because of those reasons.
Yeah,
right?
sure. It's not
really,
easy.
They're really specific to certain habitats. The neatest place I've probably seen really large numbers of them is the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
When we were doing our work out there.
Sure.
We'd see roughly 10,000 a night going to roost and be set up to catch them. You're talking about floating mist nets. That's what we use to catch long-tailed ducks and similar implants with GPS transmitters. And was really kind of neat. Some of the information that came out of that study actually showed that long-tailed ducks were associated with all of the other sea duck species. So if you were to map out areas to think about for conservation, if there was a long-tailed duck there, it probably would support a scoter or an eider or a merganser. And so using long-tailed duck mapping points out key places for conservation of sea ducks. And there's just a bunch of neat stuff that came out of that project. But that was kind of one that, they're maybe not necessarily the flagship duck of the sea duck world, but they're like an umbrella. They cover everybody, which is really kind of neat.
Man, I will say, like last year and this year, I have never seen longtails like we have. The population is just massive. It seems like there's just a ton of them around. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and I had heard in the past that they were, as far as ducks that are populated, they're one of the top ones.
They are, yeah.
Top species.
And like many of our sea ducks, we don't have really necessarily the most extensive survey opportunity for all the populations. So, how those dynamics look are less understood than a lot of our puddle ducks and especially geese as well. But long-tailed ducks are circumpolar. They're the same species globally. So a long-tailed duck in Europe is the same in Russia, is the same as in here.
Right.
They're just coming from different populations. But at
Sure.
a global scale, there's been a pretty strong reduction in the population. We're not necessarily seeing that specifically here in North America, but in other areas that they've reduced in numbers. And it's something that just kind of leads to, the management of these resources. I don't think we'll ever get to an end date where, we know everything and, if things are static, there's always things going on. And that's kind of an exciting thing for, someone on the other side that's dealing with that and ensuring that we've got stable populations and doing the things to keep those happening. But yeah, for right now, long-tailed ducks out here are doing well. And those that get after them, I think have a fun time.
Oh yeah. I mean, obviously our passion here is we love hunting sea ducks, all the scoters and the longtails, but eiders are definitely our flagship bird. I mean, they're just, as you know, they're just cool. You're not going to go everywhere and shoot a common eider.
For sure.
They have a small range and it's very sort of near and dear to our heart. So it's important that, they're still around and definitely to hear from you as to, when we shoot, why you put the season where you did. That makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, why we're not shooting them in February, you know, if you're trying to conserve that specific
Correct.
population. It's, and this is going to segue me into the thing I really wanted to talk to you about. The GPS tracking has just made everything so much more available as far as data. Like
Totally,
it's had to been a huge game changer for you guys to be able to see that data.
Yeah, definitely. And
like right now,
yeah,
where are they? You know,
yeah, like the right now where they are, but also you know, being able to, you know, waterfowl in general are great because they're a relatively large-bodied bird. And so we've got certain standards that we have to use for you know, their well-being and their health when it comes to transmitters. And transmitters need to be roughly 3% or less of the total body weight. And for a lot of birds, the technology is not there to mark. Right?
Yeah.
You think of a, you know, something really tiny like a chickadee
Yeah.
or a hummingbird.
Sure.
It's really hard to find 3% of something that weighs less than a clothespin.
Yeah.
You know, like and the technology to fit that in there.
Hard to put a backpack or something on that.
Correct. But waterfowl can carry that stuff and can do so at an extent where it doesn't, for the sake of the questions, impact what that bird's going to do. So
Right.
you think of catching an eider, putting a transmitter surgically into that bird, letting it go, and then it being able to recover from that and essentially carry on as it normally would. You know, they reproduce, they lay eggs, they do all these things while these transmitters are in them, and they're really resilient that way, which really helps us to ask these kinds of questions, run these kinds of studies, and get at these management questions, which is great for, you know, managing the resource. But the information that can come for, yes, big scale movements of, you know, where does an eider in Newfoundland versus New Brunswick versus Rhode Island go? You can answer that, but you can also put a transmitter in a bird with a different duty cycle and find out, well, what part of the coast in Newfoundland or New Brunswick or Rhode Island does that eider spend the breeding season or the fall or the winter or the spring, and you can look at real fine scale movements with a subset of birds on a different duty cycle, and that's some of the information that is trying to come from this study. We have a pretty good understanding of really big range movements of, you know, birds from New England go to here, birds from Newfoundland go to there, and, you know, Central Arctic eiders and that sort of thing. We got a pretty good understanding of the big movements, but some of the finer scale habitat interactions and what they're choosing, you know, maybe gets at another piece of that web that is sort of leading to what we're seeing in the Bay of Fundy, and waiting on that information and you know, seeing what comes from that is going to be what helps us make the next steps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, when I watched that GPS time lapse, I was just kind of blown away. I was like, wow, you know, you can actually see where they're going to go. You're not waiting for band information, you know.
Yep.
It's
yeah. Oh yeah.
No,
it's and you know, some of it's nice too that it you know, complements and really reaffirms what the banding data shows from the past.
right.
So like, you know, we were talking earlier about North Atlantic population Canada geese. Our collar work that we're doing now, you know, confirms where those birds are going that we inferred from banding data and recite collar data from, you know, the early 90s. And, you know, that's helpful too, to just sort of get an update right now of what the system's doing, where are those birds going, and get an idea that the management plan that was written is, you know, still applicable. And there's some, you know, fine tuning of information that can come and always does. And that's why these plans are open and flexible. And, you know, these population models that allow for adaptive harvest management are really key to how we're managing the resource right now, because it provides that opportunity to make a change and be able to monitor that change and see what it does.
That's cool, yeah. So what projects are you working on right now? Are you got anything you'd like to talk about as far as that goes?
Yeah,
I've kind of been firing questions at you.
No worries. So we just finished up our winter telemetry deployment on mallards and American black ducks. We put out 16 transmitters across the Maritimes, half on mallards, half on American black ducks.
Are they backpacks?
We've got backpacks, as well as we put out 10 10 geolocators, which are a light sensor, and they monitor light and dark phases. And then at different latitudes, there's a different photo period of how much daylight there is in the daytime. And so that's what this sensor monitors. We have to catch that duck again to get that sensor back. We're going to try to do that this time next year in hopes that either those sensors are still on, or if someone's to harvest a bird with a colored tarsus that's a mallard, that they send that transmitter in, and then we can download the data, and that'll give us how far north that duck went to nest from that transmitter. The backpacks give us GPS locations roughly every 10 minutes, and will give us a mountain of data that we can look at, broad scale things like reproduction, site selection for kind of big movement stuff, but as well as fine tune selection for, when a duck has a brood, what kind of habitats is she selecting, and can we do more to help manage or conserve those types of habitats for the resource. Okay. So we're finishing up, just finished up that project, and we're moving on to North Atlantic population Canada goose banding on Prince Edward Island. Technicians are going over, Ryan and Andrew, on Monday to scout, get bait out, contact landowners, do that sort of stuff in Prince Edward Island. It's a great collaborative project at the Atlantic Flyway Council level, so we have some state partners coming up to support this as well.
No way.
In addition to people tied to Ducks Unlimited and Delta and the province of Prince Edward Island as well. So it's a great collaborative project that way. And I mean, landowners too, we can't do any of these projects without access. So landowners and PI have been really supportive of that project, which is great. And we have recovered collars from either winter mortality or harvested birds that we're planning on getting out. And I think I've got 7 of those from our project. And then we're helping Indigenous partners from the Nunavut government in Labrador. They have some collars as well. And they've got specific geese of smaller size, so kind of the Greenland bird size that they're looking to get collars on. So trying to help get some collars out for those folks in that project if we catch the right sized geese. And after that, we're back for a bit, and then our breeding waterfowl surveys start the last week of April, where we fly 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer plots with helicopters and survey all the water and streams in that 5 square kilometers, and we count and identify all the waterfowl and other birds that we can see from a helicopter anyway. So, things like grouse and eagles and hawks and things like that, herons and cormorants and stuff. And that all goes into our population monitoring that comes out in that population report that you were talking about. And from there, we start our preseason duck banding in August, and we've got targets and quotas to get for putting new bands out every year, and that allows us to assess harvest rates, which leads back to how many of each of those species are getting harvested and at what rate, and that all plays into these population models that we use to set season dates and limits.
Now, it seems to me, I know that at the Maritime Forestry College, they always do banding of geese in their during their molt. So those would be what we would call temperate or resident geese. Yep. And we always find in the early season, if we do any amount of hunting, like there's generally banded geese getting shot. Mm-hmm. And whether they, normally for us they're from Maine or whatnot. Sometimes they're from New Brunswick. But is that a program that you guys participate in, or is that just sort of local people doing or local NGOs?
So I mean, there's not that I'm aware of in terms of local NGOs, but yes, the Forestry College there in Fredericton has done that in the past as part of their training program for their students. We have off and on for many years done temperate breeding banding rotationally through New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and most recently in Prince Edward Island. it's something that we have a bit of logistical constraints just in timing and opportunity at the moment to be kind of broadly on the landscape to do that in an effective way. There's kind of minimum numbers that would be ideal to put out every year. And if we can't quite do that, the information that comes, we just don't get enough band returns across the landscape to have really an effective understanding of what that harvest rate is. But we do know that within that population, again, we talked about that there's roughly 1 million of them at the flyway level. So in terms of their stability, they're kind of stable or slightly increasing. And for our considerations of the early season, there's no conservation impacts of that early season and what the current bag limits are or season dates.
Yeah. So that's not really you guys are more interested in like your NAP and
just for what the timing is and what our current opportunities are, just with staff and time. We do have to focus on kind of, I don't want to call them, key priorities, but there are populations that having a little bit more understanding is going to be helpful for the management of those. And the key ones we have right now are North Atlantic population, Canada geese, and American black ducks, and then we have some banding targets also for mallards, green-winged teal, ringnecks, and wood ducks.
Okay,
and that's specifically for my program here in the Maritimes. We've talked a little bit about eiders and such, and that's more led by our marine game bird biologist, who's Bob Rogers in Newfoundland, that kind of takes on that role of managing that stuff. So
the eiders.
Yep, the eiders and
makes sense. That's a good spot.
Yeah, mergansers and scoters and all of those. So he's tied more into that than I am, and it's really at some point practically we can't do everything.
No.
And we need to do what's needed for managing and for setting regs and seasons that effectively, so we know what we're doing and what we're talking about. And we put a lot of effort into those programs I mentioned, so that we do those well and try to meet those targets and have a good understanding of what those populations are doing.
Good, yeah. So just, I guess, one last thing, and Rowan, you can fire away if you had anything after this, but I just want to, everybody kind of has a thing, like I was saying there. I'm interested in all waterfowl, and I would say birds really, but, and my thing is, again, geese. But what's your passion? Do you have a specific passion, or is it, you grew up with birds?
It's a tough one. You probably have to throw a species group at me, and I could tell you which one I like the most. But
okay.
I just like birds. I've always just liked birds. I still have passion for all things birds. We do a whole bunch of other stuff in our own time with owl surveys, and I do a woodcock survey, and
do you really
do a bunch of things.
That's awesome.
Way. I talked about volunteering. I'm still doing that for citizen science programs because it's a passion. I know the data goes to good stuff, and I find value in doing it. There's I talked about the 365 addiction. I don't have a day or moment where I'm not thinking, talking, doing, or working with waterfowl, and that's great. They say that if you love your job, you don't work a day in your life, and I am living that, and that is great.
That's awesome.
In terms of pursuits, I've chased them a lot of places and things. For me at this point, it's the whole picture that's really fun. So, having, I've got a yellow lab that I run. I don't have anything higher than I'd call him he's a meat dog. He is what he does. He does what he's supposed to do. He's 7. He's in that magical sweet spot where he knows it's game time, and you don't have to do a lot of ABCs anymore. So that's good fun. I really enjoy eating birds, new recipes, different ways, and just stuff that I know everyone's going to like. And that's really what it is. It's a great organic, renewable, awesome resource that I really enjoy having. And work at a professional level to try to keep that going, and that's inspiring for me. And seeing birds are coming back. We had a pair of pintails in town here this week, and we haven't seen those in a couple months, so it's happening, and that's super exciting. And you just follow them around the clock, and it's good times. So I can't give you one. Maybe that's my 3-minute answer to say I can't answer your question, but being waterfowl focused, I think anybody that understands that sentiment understands exactly what's going through my mind right now.
Oh, I get it. Yeah. We could wear this thing out talking for sure. Geez, there's the sun coming up.
Yeah.
You probably got to get to work. Yeah. No. I totally get it. And for me to hear that coming from you, I mean, that's you're sitting in the right chair. Like, you're a hunter. You're a waterfowler. You're a bird nut. You love waterfowl, you still volunteer, you're interested in all things waterfowl. I mean, you are living your dream.
Mm-hmm.
You have days where you work, but it doesn't seem like it. You're out in a marsh with mosquitoes attacking you, and while it may not be great,
still having fun.
You're still having fun,
yeah,
right?
Sure.
It's the same thing with what I do, right? It's my absolute passion.
Definitely.
And it could be the worst day ever weather-wise, and you're just like, man, there's a lot of other things I could be doing that I wouldn't still enjoy as much as this.
Totally. And I think too, and you really speak to it, there's all sorts of different avenues that people can be tied to, whether it's waterfowl or fishing or big game or whatever it might be. But it's kind of invigorating and empowering to look across the landscape where you meet people and they share that, and those people come across from, the ground up, NGO, Delta chapter kind of guys, all the way up to, where people are making decisions for management. And I think I find it encouraging and empowering for me to be able to look out and know that, people that are in the industry and people that are, in managing the resource all share that same passion and are working towards, the same end. You maybe have different avenues to get there, or different, decisions that get made, or ideas or thoughts. But in the end, we're, everyone's going the same way. And I think that's really kind of neat about how this resource works, because that passion's shared all the way through the ladder, and that's really cool.
Yeah, that's definitely what you want. Rowan, you got anything to say?
I think I'm good. I think I got the school question out, and that was pretty much all I was looking for.
Perfect. Wonderful.
Yeah. Well, that's been great, man. We really appreciate your time. Really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, no, my pleasure.
Sharing some about what you've been doing here and what your job looks like. And it's great for me to hear, and I know everybody else will appreciate it too, how passionate you are about this job and how much you enjoy. I mean, if you're going to be a waterfowl biologist, you should enjoy waterfowl, but you can tell that you really love what you do. You just really love birds, and you got into talking about some of the other birds across the country that I've never even heard of, but because I like hearing about that stuff. It's pretty neat, right? And otherwise you wouldn't know. So
sure, yeah.
No, we really appreciate you coming on. And
my pleasure. Appreciate you coming down and meeting me here. And it was a good chat, and glad I've done so.
Yeah, hopefully we can work together in the future.
Yeah, definitely.
Magical place.
Yeah. Send me pictures of birds in the next 2 months, and black ducks in September, and we'll see what we can do.
Sounds good, brother.
For sure.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, pleasure. Take care. Thank you.